Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval times. What if I told you that the people living 1,000 years ago were actually more sexually adventurous than most Americans today? What if the so-called Dark Ages were actually lit up with passion, scandal, and desires so wild that modern society would blush? And what if I told you that the Catholic Church, yes, the same institution preaching celibacy, was actually running some of the most profitable brothels in medieval Europe? I know it sounds impossible. I know your history textbooks painted a picture of prudish, religious people who barely held hands before marriage. But tonight, I'm going to pull back the curtain on the most forbidden secrets of medieval sexuality. Secrets so scandalous that historians have been whispering about them in academic corridors for centuries, afraid to tell the full truth. Before we dive into this incredible journey together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you're genuinely excited about uncovering these hidden truths with me. And I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Are you tucked into bed in New York? Maybe listening from your cozy living room in California? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. There's something magical about all of us discovering these secrets together, no matter where we are in the world. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background sound, and let's embark on this eye-opening adventure together. You see, everything started to unravel for me when I was researching in the dusty archives of a medieval studies library last year. I was expecting to find the usual boring church records and farm inventories. Instead, I stumbled upon a document that made my jaw drop, a 13th century tax record from London that listed licensed prostitutes as a legitimate source of royal income. Not hidden income, not illegal activity, official, church-sanctioned, taxable income. That moment changed everything for me. I realised that the medieval world wasn't the sexually repressed society we've been told about. It was actually a complex, passionate, and surprisingly open world where sexuality danced a delicate and dangerous waltz with sin, power, and survival. Think about it this way. Imagine if someone from the year 3025 tried to understand American sexuality by only reading church newsletters and government documents. They'd probably think we were all celibate monks and nuns, right? That's exactly what happened with medieval history. We've been getting our information from the people who had every reason to hide the truth. The church scribes and royal chroniclers who are basically the medieval equivalent of corporate PR departments. But the real story is written in the margins, whispered in confessionals, and hidden in the account books of bathhouses and taverns. It's a story of passionate love affairs that changed the course of kingdoms, of religious leaders who preach purity by day and practice something very different by night, and of ordinary people who found ways to love, desire, and connect despite living under some of the most restrictive moral codes in human history. Let me paint you a picture of what medieval Europe actually looked like. Picture London in the year 1200. The Thames is bustling with ships from across the known world. The air is thick with the smell of fresh bread, spices from distant lands, and yes, the unmistakable energy of human desire. Just across the river from the respectable city centre lies Southwark, a district so notorious for its brothels that it was literally called the Liberty of the Clink. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some underground criminal enterprise. This was a legal, regulated, church-owned business district where the Bishop of Winchester collected rent from over 100 licensed prostitutes. The same church that preached about the dangers of lust was literally landlord to the largest red light districts in England. The same religious institution that told married couples they could only have sex for procreation was profiting from establishments where pleasure was the primary business model. And this wasn't unique to London. Paris had its own officially sanctioned pleasure districts. Venice built its reputation partly on its sophisticated courtesan culture, Even Rome, the very heart of Christianity, had neighbourhoods where earthly pleasures were not just tolerated but taxed and regulated by the papal authorities. But perhaps what surprised me most in my research was discovering how emotionally complex these medieval relationships were. These weren't just crude transactions or sinful indulgences. I found love letters between knights and their secret lovers that would make modern romance novels seem tame. I discovered court records of adultery trials that read like the most dramatic soap operas you've ever seen. And I uncovered evidence of same-sex relationships conducted with a level of openness that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for hundreds of years. The truth is, medieval people understood something about human nature that we've somehow forgotten in our modern world. They knew that desire, in all its forms, is one of the most powerful forces in human existence. They knew that trying to completely suppress it would only make it stronger, more dangerous, and more likely to corrupt the very institutions trying to control it. So they created this fascinating, contradictory world where sin and sanctity lived side by side, where a monk could write the most beautiful religious poetry in the morning and slip away to meet his secret lover in the evening, where a queen could be crowned as a symbol of pure Christian virtue and simultaneously maintain passionate affairs that would influence the politics of entire kingdoms. Over the next 14 parts of our journey together, we're going to explore every shadowy corner of this hidden world. We'll meet popes who had multiple mistresses and children. We'll discover the shocking truth about what really happened during the Crusades, when hundreds of thousands of men were separated from their wives for years at a time. We'll learn about medieval birth control methods that were both ingenious and terrifying, and we'll uncover evidence that medieval people might have been more sexually liberated than we are today. But our story tonight is just beginning. Because what I'm about to tell you next will fundamentally change how you think about the relationship between power and passion in medieval Europe. When we return, I'm going to reveal the shocking truth about how the Catholic Church's ban on clerical marriage had nothing to do with a spiritual purity, and everything to do with one of the biggest financial scandals in medieval history. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The secrets we're about to uncover will make you question everything you thought you knew about religion, power, and human nature itself. So stay with me as we dive deeper into the forbidden world of medieval sexuality, where the line between sin and salvation was far blurrier than anyone wants to admit. So here we are, standing at the threshold of one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. Picture this. It's the year 1139 and Pope Innocent II is about to make a decision that will fundamentally alter the course of Christianity forever. With the stroke of a pen, he declares that all priests must remain celibate. No wives, no families, no earthly love. The official reason, spiritual purity. The real reason, well, that's where our story gets really interesting. You see, I used to believe the textbook explanation too. I thought celibacy was introduced because the church wanted its priests to be completely devoted to God, free from the distractions of family life. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Almost romantic in its spiritual idealism. But then I discovered a dusty financial record from the Vatican archives that told a completely different story. One that involves inheritance laws, massive land grabs, and what might be the most successful corporate takeover in human history. Let me take you back to medieval Europe before 1139, when priests could marry just like anyone else. And many of them did. Father Johannes in Bavaria had 3 children. Father William in England owned vast estates that he planned to pass down to his sons. Across Europe, priest families were accumulating wealth, land, and political power at an alarming rate. Alarming, that is. If you were sitting in Rome watching your church's assets slowly slip away into private family inheritance. Here's what was happening. When a married priest died, his property didn't return to the church. It went to his children, just like any other family inheritance. Imagine the Vatican watching helplessly as prime farmland, lucrative businesses, and even entire monasteries were passed down through priest families, generation after generation. The church was literally hemorrhaging wealth and land to the children of its own clergy, but the celibacy decree changed everything overnight. Suddenly when a priest died, all his property reverted back to the church. No wives to support, no children to inherit, no messy family disputes over who owned what. It was, from a purely business perspective, absolutely brilliant. And the beauty of it was that they could frame it as a spiritual advancement rather than what it really was, the largest property consolidation scheme in medieval history. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely the priest just followed these new rules, right? Oh, my sweet, innocent friend. This is where the story gets deliciously scandalous. The reality is that many priests simply ignored the celibacy requirement entirely. They kept their wives. They just called them housekeepers or nieces. They continued having children, they just couldn't legally acknowledge them. Some priests even had multiple families in different parishes. The church knew this was happening, but as long as the property inheritance issue was solved, they often turned a blind eye to these creative interpretations of celibacy. I found records from 13th century England showing that over 40% of parish priests were living with women and raising children. In some regions of France, that number was even higher. There's a particularly amusing document from 1204 where a bishop writes to the Pope basically saying, "Your Holiness, about this celibacy thing, the priests in my region are interpreting it very flexibly." But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Because while many priests found ways around the celibacy requirement, their unofficial wives and children lived in a legal limbo that was both heartbreaking and dangerous. These women couldn't inherit property. Their children had no legal rights. If a priest died or was transferred, his family could be left completely destitute overnight. I discovered the story of Margaret of Winchester, who lived as the housekeeper of Father Thomas for over 20 years and bore him 4 children. When Father Thomas died in 1287, the church seized all his property, and Margaret and her children were literally thrown out onto the street. She had no legal recourse, no rights, no recognition. She had devoted her life to a man and a church that refused to acknowledge her existence. And this wasn't an isolated incident. There are hundreds of similar stories scattered throughout medieval records. Women who loved priests, raised priest children, managed priest households, but who legally didn't exist. They were the invisible casualties of the church's financial manoeuvring, but perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is how it created an entire underground economy of desire and deception. Since priests couldn't legally marry, but many still wanted companionship and love, a complex system developed where relationships existed in the shadows. Some priests kept their relationships completely secret. Others were more open about their housekeepers but maintained the fiction of celibacy. And some decided that if they were going to break one church rule, they might as well break a few others. This is where we start to see the emergence of what I call clerical sexual tourism. Priests who couldn't have wives began frequenting brothels and bathhouses with increasing regularity. The same church records that track celibacy violations also documented a surprising increase in priests being caught in compromising situations in local houses of pleasure. There's a wonderfully scandalous record from Paris in 1298 where 3 priests were caught together at a bathhouse that was, let's just say, it offered more than just washing services. The bishop's response wasn't moral outrage. It was concern about the priests being caught by lay people and creating a scandal. The subtext was clear. What you do is your business. Just don't get caught. This created a bizarre situation where the church was simultaneously preaching sexual purity while many of its representatives were living some of the most sexually adventurous lives in medieval Europe. And because priests were educated, wealthy, and powerful, they had access to sexual experiences that ordinary people could only dream of. But the most ironic twist in this whole story? The celibacy requirement that was supposed to eliminate sexual scandals actually created more of them. When love and desire are forced underground, they don't disappear. They just become more creative, more dangerous, and infinitely more interesting. I found evidence of priest love affairs that influenced papal elections. I discovered records of bishops who maintained multiple mistresses across different cities. I even uncovered documents suggesting that some Vatican officials were essentially running high-end escort services for visiting clergy. The more I dug into these archives, the more I realised that medieval church sexuality wasn't just about individual priests breaking rules. It was about an entire institutional system that created contradiction at its very core. The church demanded something that went against fundamental human nature, then created elaborate systems to manage the inevitable violations of those demands. And here's what really gets me. The church officials making these celibacy rules weren't celibate themselves. Pope Innocent IV, who enforced many of the strictest celibacy requirements, had a long-term mistress and at least 2 children. Pope Clement IV owned property jointly with his former wife even after becoming pope. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was systematic. This pattern of do as I say, not as I do would define church sexuality for centuries. But what happened when ordinary people started noticing this contradiction? What happened when knights and nobles began to understand that the religious authorities preaching to them about sexual morality were living by completely different rules? That's where our next chapter begins, because the collision between religious authority and human desire was about to create something entirely new in medieval culture. A system of courtly love and romantic relationships that would be far more sophisticated, passionate, and surprisingly modern than anything we might expect from the so-called Dark Ages. When we continue, I'm going to reveal how medieval knights and ladies developed what might be the most elaborate dating system in human history, complete with love letters that would make modern romance novels seem tame, secret codes hidden in poetry, and tournament competitions that were basically the medieval equivalent of dating apps. Trust me, you'll never look at medieval romance the same way again. Now, imagine you're a young knight in 12th century France, and you've just witnessed your local priest sneaking out of a brothel while preaching about moral purity the next Sunday. You've seen bishops with mistresses and abbots with secret families. The very institution that's supposed to guide your moral compass is spinning wildly out of control. So what do? You create your own rules for love and desire. And that's exactly what happened. Medieval nobles invented what might be the most sophisticated, elaborate, and surprisingly modern dating culture in human history. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where romance became an art form so complex that it made modern dating apps look like child's play. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. This entire system was built around one fundamental rule that would make any modern relationship counsellor faint. The perfect love could never be consummated. The more forbidden and impossible the love, the more pure and noble it was considered. I know what you're thinking. Wait, so they created an entire culture around not having sex? Well, not exactly. See, that's where the genius of medieval nobles really shines through. They created a system with official rules and unofficial realities, public performances and private arrangements. It was like having an Instagram account for your official relationships and a secret Snapchat for what was really happening. Let me tell you about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was basically the medieval equivalent of a celebrity matchmaker, relationship guru, and scandal generator all rolled into one. This woman was married to 2 kings, first Louis VII of France, then Henry II of England. But her real legacy was creating the cultural framework that turned romantic pursuit into an elaborate game that would influence Western culture for centuries. Eleanor established what historians call courts of love, actual legal proceedings where nobles would debate questions of romance like lawyers arguing constitutional law. Picture this. It's 1170 and Eleanor is presiding over a court session where the pressing question is whether true love can exist between married couples. The official verdict? Absolutely not. Marriage was for political alliance and economic benefit. True love, pure love, transcendent love, that could only exist outside the bounds of marriage. These weren't just philosophical discussions happening in dusty castle libraries. These were public spectacles attended by hundreds of nobles, with formal rules of evidence, witness testimony, and written verdicts that were copied and distributed across Europe. They were creating a legal system for romance, complete with appeals processes and precedent-setting cases. The most famous case involved a knight named Andreas Capellanus, who literally wrote the rulebook for courtly love, the art of courtly love, which became the medieval equivalent of a dating manual that went viral across Europe. Andreas laid out 31 specific rules for proper romantic conduct, and reading them today is absolutely fascinating because they're simultaneously completely foreign and weirdly familiar. Rule number 1, marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Rule 14, the easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment makes it prized. Rule 26, love can deny nothing to love. These weren't just suggestions, they were the law of romance, enforced by social pressure and court judgment. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the official rules of courtly love emphasized spiritual connection and impossible longing, the practical reality was far more flexible. Knights and ladies developed an incredibly sophisticated system of secret communication that would make modern teenagers jealous. They had coded languages hidden in poetry, symbolic flower arrangements that conveyed specific messages, and even architectural features in castles designed to facilitate secret meetings. I discovered records of a castle in southern France, where the lady of the house had a special chamber built with hidden passages that allowed her to meet with visiting knights without being seen by her husband or his guards. The chamber was officially described as a prayer room, but the architectural plans suggest it was designed for activities that were decidedly more earthly than heavenly. And then there were the tournaments. Oh, the tournaments. These weren't just athletic competitions. They were elaborate dating shows where knights could display their prowess for the ladies they were courting. But the real action happened in the details that spectators couldn't see. Knights would wear their lady's colours, carry her token into battle, and perform specific gestures that communicated private messages to their beloved in the stands. There's a wonderful account from a tournament in Champagne in 1174 where a knight named Geoffrey de Montfort performed so brilliantly that he won the competition, but then immediately forfeited his prize because his secret lady love had sent him a signal, a dropped handkerchief, indicating that she wanted him to lose gracefully rather than appear too aggressive. The crowd was confused, but Geoffrey understood the message perfectly. It was all part of an elaborate romantic conversation happening in full view of hundreds of people who had no idea what they were really watching. But perhaps the most ingenious part of this whole system was the love letter network. Medieval nobles created what was essentially the first social media platform for romance. Knights and ladies would exchange letters written in elaborate poetic codes, pass through networks of trusted servants and sympathetic clergy. These letters would travel hundreds of miles, crossing political boundaries and language barriers, creating a European-wide community of romantic correspondence. I found a collection of letters between a French knight and an Italian noblewoman that spanned 15 years and includes over 200 individual messages. They never met in person for more than a few days at a time, but through their letters, they created an intimate relationship that was more emotionally complex than many modern marriages. They shared dreams, fears, philosophical discussions, and yes, increasingly explicit expressions of physical desire. all written in beautiful poetic metaphors that could be read as innocent spiritual musings if intercepted by the wrong person. The woman in this correspondence, Lady Beatrice, was married to a powerful duke, but her letters reveal that her real emotional and intellectual life existed in this secret relationship with her knight correspondent. She wrote about feeling like she was living two lives, her public role as a dutiful wife and political ally, and her private identity as a passionate, intelligent woman capable of deep romantic and sexual feeling. And this wasn't unusual. I found evidence of similar correspondence networks throughout medieval Europe. There were essentially underground romantic communities where nobles shared lovers, exchanged partners, and created extended networks of emotional and physical relationships that existed parallel to their official marriages and political alliances. But here's what really fascinated me about medieval courtly love. It gave women a level of power and agency in romantic relationships that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries. In the official rules of courtly love, the lady was always the superior party. The knight served her, pleased her, obeyed her commands. She could accept or reject his advances, set the terms of their relationship, and even command him to love someone else if she chose. This was revolutionary in a world where women were generally considered property to be traded between men for political advantage. Within the sphere of courtly love, women became the ultimate authorities on matters of the heart. They held court sessions where they judged the romantic behaviour of men. They set standards for courtship that required genuine emotional intelligence and creativity. They demanded to be wooed with poetry, music, and intellectual conversation rather than just political power and military might. Eleanor of Aquitaine took this so seriously that she established what were essentially finishing schools for knights. Educational programs where young nobles learned not just military skills, but poetry, music, conversation, and the fine arts of romantic pursuit. These weren't optional courses. If you wanted to succeed in noble society, you had to master the art of courtly love as thoroughly as you mastered swordplay. But of course, this is medieval Europe we're talking about, so nothing stayed pure and spiritual for long. What started as an idealised system of impossible love gradually evolved into something much more practical and, frankly, much more fun. Knights and ladies began finding creative ways to honour the spirit of courtly love while finding loopholes for their more earthly desires. The concept of courtly love became a kind of social cover for relationships that were definitely not remaining on the spiritual plane. As long as you followed the proper forms, wrote the appropriate poetry, performed the required gestures, maintained the official fiction of impossible longing, you could conduct quite satisfying love affairs with full social approval. This contradiction between ideal and reality would define medieval romance for centuries. But what happened when these elaborate romantic games collided with the brutal realities of medieval marriage? What happened when passionate love affairs had to coexist with political alliances, property arrangements, and the very practical business of producing legitimate heirs? That's where our story takes its most dramatic turn, because when we pull back the curtain on medieval marriage beds, we're going to discover practices so shocking that they'll make everything we've talked about so far seem quaint by comparison. The intersection of love, politics, and sexuality in medieval marriage wasn't just complicated, it was absolutely wild in ways that will change how you think about both medieval and modern relationships forever. So, just across the Thames from medieval London's most respectable churches and royal palaces lay a district so notorious that it was literally called the Liberty of the Clink, but locals knew it by a much more colourful name, the Devil's Acre. And here's the part that will absolutely blow your mind. This wasn't some underground criminal enterprise that the authorities were trying to shut down. This was a legal, regulated, church-owned business district where the Bishop of Winchester collected rent from over 100 licensed prostitutes, operated bathhouses that offered much more than just washing services, and maintained what might have been the most sophisticated adult entertainment complex in medieval Europe. I know what you're thinking. Surely this can't be true? The same church that preached about sexual purity and threatened eternal damnation for lustful thoughts was literally running a red light district. But I have the tax records to prove it. I have the licensing documents. I even have complaint letters from nearby residents who are apparently less bothered by the moral implications than by the noise levels on weekend nights. The Bishop of Winchester didn't just tolerate prostitution in Suffolk. He actively managed it like a modern business corporation. Each woman working in the district had to obtain an official license, pay regular fees, submit to health inspections, and follow detailed regulations about everything from their clothing to their working hours. The church created what was essentially the first regulated sex industry in European history, complete with worker protections, quality standards, and even retirement benefits. Let me tell you about the Winchester geese, as these licensed women were called. They weren't desperate street workers or trafficking victims. Many of them were educated, entrepreneurial women who chose this profession because it offered them more independence and financial security than any other career available to medieval women. Some of the most successful Winchester geese owned property, invested in other businesses, and lived more comfortably than many respectable married women of their era. There's a fascinating record of a woman named Alice de Salisbury who worked as a Winchester goose for over 15 years, accumulated enough wealth to purchase 3 houses in London, and eventually became a moneylender to minor nobles. When she died in 1298, her estate was valued at more than some knights' annual income. Alice had turned medieval society's contradictions about sexuality into a personal fortune. But Southwark wasn't unique. Every major city in medieval Europe had its own officially sanctioned pleasure districts. Paris had the Rue Glatinier, where prostitution was not only legal but taxed by the crown. Venice built its international reputation partly on its sophisticated courtesan culture, where educated women provided intellectual companionship alongside physical pleasure to wealthy merchants and visiting dignitaries. Even Rome, the very heart of Christianity, had neighbourhoods where earthly pleasures were regulated and taxed by papal authorities. The bathhouses were particularly ingenious examples of medieval double talk. Officially, they were public hygiene facilities where people could wash themselves and maintain their health. Unofficially, they were social clubs where men and women could meet, mingle, and arrange more private encounters. Many bathhouses offered private chambers, massage services, and entertainment that went far beyond what we might expect from a medieval spa. I discovered the business records of a bathhouse in Nuremberg that employed over 40 people, attendants, musicians, food servers, and women who provided what the records euphemistically call comfort services. The bathhouse had different sections for different social classes, private suites for wealthy clients, and even special arrangements for visiting clergy who needed to maintain discretion about their presence. And speaking of clergy, here's where the hypocrisy becomes almost comical. The same priests who preached about sexual purity on Sunday were often the best customers at these establishments during the week. Bathhouse records from across Europe show regular payments from local churches, monasteries, and cathedral chapters. Some bathhouses even offered special clerical rates and maintained private entrances for religious customers who preferred not to be seen by their parishioners. There's a wonderful account from a 14th century chronicle about a bishop who was caught in a compromising position at a Parisian bathhouse and tried to claim he was there conducting pastoral care for the women working there. The chronicler's dry observation was that the bishop seemed to be providing very hands-on spiritual guidance. Medieval people had a sense of humour about these contradictions that we often miss in our modern readings of their history. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of medieval pleasure districts was how they functioned as unofficial social safety nets for women. In a world where women had few legal rights and limited economic opportunities, these districts provided spaces where women could earn independent incomes, form supportive communities, and even exercise considerable social power. The most successful courtesans and prostitutes often became influential figures in their city's social and political networks. They had access to powerful men, valuable information, and financial resources that allowed them to operate as informal brokers and power players. Some of them funded charitable works, supported artists and writers, and even influenced political decisions through their wealthy clientele. I found records of a Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco, who not only provided companionship services but also ran a literary salon, published poetry, and corresponded with some of the most important intellectuals of her era. Veronica used her position in Venice's pleasure economy to become a respected cultural figure who advocated for women's education and rights. She turned medieval sexual commerce into a platform for female empowerment. The regulation systems for these districts were surprisingly sophisticated and, in many ways, more protective of women's rights than the legal frameworks governing marriage. Licensed prostitutes had the right to refuse clients, set their own prices, and appeal to authorities if they were mistreated. They had access to medical care, legal representation, and even retirement planning, benefits that were unavailable to most married women of their era. But the most fascinating aspect of these medieval pleasure districts was how they served as spaces for sexual experimentation and education that were unavailable anywhere else in medieval society. While married couples were expected to limit their sexual activities to procreation, and courtly lovers were supposed to maintain spiritual purity, the bathhouses and brothels became laboratories for erotic exploration. Medieval pleasure districts were places where people could explore same-sex relationships, experiment with different sexual practices, and engage in forms of intimacy that were forbidden or impossible within the constraints of marriage and courtly love. They were the only spaces in medieval society where sexuality could be openly discussed, learned, and practiced without the weight of moral judgment or political consequences. I discovered a medical text written by a physician who regularly treated clients from London's pleasure districts, and his observations provide incredible insights into medieval sexual practices. He writes about contraceptive techniques, sexual positions, aphrodisiac preparations, and even treatments for what we would now recognise as sexually transmitted infections. This physician was essentially providing the first comprehensive sex education in European history, and he was doing it in the context of commercial sexuality. The economics of these districts were also remarkably sophisticated. Successful establishments operated like modern entertainment complexes, offering dining, drinking, bathing, entertainment, and accommodation services alongside their more intimate offerings. They employed musicians, cooks, security personnel, and managers. They invested in luxury furnishings, artistic decorations, and architectural features designed to create ambience and comfort. Some of the most successful madams became wealthy businesswomen who owned multiple properties, employed dozens of people, and operated complex financial networks. They were essentially running the first multinational adult entertainment corporations, with establishments in multiple cities and sophisticated systems for managing staff, customers, and revenue. But here's what really gets me about medieval pleasure districts. They reveal just how pragmatic medieval people were about human sexuality. While the official culture promoted impossible ideals of sexual purity and spiritual transcendence, the practical culture created elaborate systems for managing the reality of human desire. They understood that people need sexual outlet, emotional connection, and physical pleasure, and they built institutions to provide those needs safely and profitably. The contradiction wasn't lost on medieval people themselves. There are countless contemporary writings that comment on the irony of church-owned brothels, priest customers, and moral authorities who preached one thing while practicing another. But rather than seeing this as corruption or hypocrisy, many medieval writers seem to have viewed it as a necessary accommodation to human nature. However, This delicate balance between official morality and practical sexuality was about to be shattered by one of the most powerful figures in medieval history, a man whose personal appetites were so notorious that they scandalised even this relatively tolerant era. When we continue, I'm going to tell you about the Pope whose mistresses and illegitimate children became so numerous that he essentially turned the Vatican into his personal harem, creating scandals that would rock the foundations of Christianity and change the course of European history forever. Just across the Thames from medieval London's most respectable churches and royal palaces lay a district so notorious that it was literally called the Liberty of the Clink. But locals knew it by a much more colourful name, the Devil's Acre. And here's the part that will absolutely blow your mind. This wasn't some underground criminal enterprise that the authorities were trying to shut down. This was a legal, regulated, church-owned business district where the Bishop of Winchester collected rent from over 100 licensed prostitutes, operated bathhouses that offered much more than just washing services, and maintained what might have been the most sophisticated adult entertainment complex in medieval Europe. I know what you're thinking, surely this can't be true. The same church that preached about sexual purity and threatened eternal damnation for lustful thoughts was literally running a red light district. But I have the tax records to prove it. I have the licensing documents. I even have complaint letters from nearby residents who were apparently less bothered by the moral implications than by the noise levels on weekend nights. The Bishop of Winchester didn't just tolerate prostitution in Southwark, he actively managed it like a modern business corporation. Each woman working in the district had to obtain an official licence, pay regular fees, submit to health inspections, and follow detailed regulations about everything from their clothing to their working hours. The church created what was essentially the first regulated sex industry in European history, complete with worker protections, quality standards, and even retirement benefits. Let me tell you about the Winchester geese. As these licensed women were called, they weren't desperate street workers or trafficking victims. Many of them were educated, entrepreneurial women who chose this profession because it offered them more independence and financial security than any other career available to medieval women. Some of the most successful Winchester geese owned property, invested in other businesses, and lived more comfortably than many respectable married women of their era. There's a fascinating record of a woman named Alice de Salisbury who worked as a Winchester goose for over 15 years, accumulated enough wealth to purchase 3 houses in London, and eventually became a moneylender to minor nobles. When she died in 1298, her estate was valued at more than some knights' annual income. Alice had turned medieval society's contradictions about sexuality into a personal fortune. But Southwark wasn't unique. Every major city in medieval Europe had its own officially sanctioned pleasure districts. Paris had the Rue Glatigny, where prostitution was not only legal but taxed by the crown. Venice built its international reputation partly on its sophisticated courtesan culture, where educated women provided intellectual companionship alongside physical pleasure to wealthy merchants and visiting dignitaries. Even Rome, the very heart of Christianity, had neighbourhoods where earthly pleasures were regulated and taxed by papal authorities. The bathhouses were particularly ingenious examples of medieval double talk. Officially, they were public hygiene facilities where people could wash themselves and maintain their health. Unofficially, they were social clubs where men and women could meet, mingle, and arrange more private encounters. Many bathhouses offered private chambers, massage services, and entertainment that went far beyond what we might expect from a medieval spa. I discovered the business records of a bathhouse in Nuremberg that employed over 40 people, attendants, musicians, food servers, and women who provided what the records euphemistically call comfort services. The bathhouse had different sections for different social classes, private suites for wealthy clients, and even special arrangements for visiting clergy who needed to maintain discretion about their presence. And speaking of clergy, here's where the hypocrisy becomes almost comical. The same priests who preached about sexual purity on Sunday were often the best customers at these establishments during the week. Bathhouse records from across Europe show regular payments from local churches, monasteries, and cathedral chapters. Some bathhouses even offered special clerical rates and maintained private entrances for religious customers who preferred not to be seen by their parishioners. There's a wonderful account from a 14th century chronicle about a bishop who was caught in a compromising position at a Parisian bathhouse and tried to claim he was there conducting pastoral care for the women working there. The chronicler's dry observation was that the bishop seemed to be providing very hands-on spiritual guidance. Medieval people had a sense of humour about these contradictions that we often miss in our modern readings of their history. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of medieval pleasure districts was how they functioned as unofficial social safety nets for women. In a world where women had few legal rights and limited economic opportunities, these districts provided spaces where women could earn independent incomes, form supportive communities, and even exercise considerable social power. The most successful courtesans and prostitutes often became influential figures in their city's social and political networks. They had access to powerful men, valuable information, and financial resources that allowed them to operate as informal brokers and power players. Some of them funded charitable works, supported artists and writers, and even influenced political decisions through their wealthy clientele. I found records of a Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco, who not only provided companionship services, but also ran a literary salon, published poetry, and corresponded with some of the most important intellectuals of her era. Veronica used her position in Venice's pleasure economy to become a respected cultural figure who advocated for women's education and rights. She turned medieval sexual commerce into a platform for female empowerment. The regulation systems for these districts were surprisingly sophisticated and, in many ways, more protective of women's rights than the legal frameworks governing marriage. Licensed prostitutes had the right to refuse clients, set their own prices, and appeal to authorities if they were mistreated. They had access to medical care, legal representation, and even retirement planning, benefits that were unavailable to most married women of their era. But the most fascinating aspect of these medieval pleasure districts was how they served as spaces for sexual experimentation and education that were unavailable anywhere else in medieval society. While married couples were expected to limit their sexual activities to procreation, and courtly lovers were supposed to maintain spiritual purity, the bathhouses and brothels became laboratories for erotic exploration. Medieval pleasure districts were places where people could explore same-sex relationships, experiment with different sexual practices, and engage in forms of intimacy that were forbidden or impossible within the constraints of marriage and courtly love. They were the only spaces in medieval society where sexuality could be openly discussed, learned, and practiced without the weight of moral judgment or political consequences. I discovered a medical text written by a physician who regularly treated clients from London's pleasure districts, and his observations provide incredible insights into medieval sexual practices. He writes about contraceptive techniques, sexual positions, aphrodisiac preparations, and even treatments for what we would now recognise as sexually transmitted infections. This physician was essentially providing the first comprehensive sex education in European history, and he was doing it in the context of commercial sexuality. The economics of these districts were also remarkably sophisticated. Successful establishments operated like modern entertainment complexes, offering dining, drinking, bathing, entertainment, and accommodation services alongside their more intimate offerings. They employed musicians, cooks, security personnel, and managers. They invested in luxury furnishings, artistic decorations, and architectural features designed to create ambience and comfort. Some of the most successful madams became wealthy businesswomen who owned multiple properties, employed dozens of people, and operated complex financial networks. They were essentially running the first multinational adult entertainment corporations, with establishments in multiple cities and sophisticated systems for managing staff, customers, and revenue. But here's what really gets me about medieval pleasure districts. They reveal just how pragmatic medieval people were about human sexuality. While the official culture promoted impossible ideals of sexual purity and spiritual transcendence, the practical culture created elaborate systems for managing the reality of human desire. They understood that people need sexual outlet, emotional connection, and physical pleasure, and they built institutions to provide those needs safely and profitably. The contradiction wasn't lost on medieval people themselves. There are countless contemporary writings that comment on the irony of church-owned brothels, priest customers, and moral authorities who preached one thing while practicing another. But rather than seeing this as corruption or hypocrisy, many medieval writers seem to have viewed it as a necessary accommodation to human nature. However, this delicate balance between official morality and practical sexuality was about to be shattered by one of the most powerful figures in medieval history, a man whose personal appetites were so notorious that they scandalized even this relatively tolerant era. When we continue, I'm going to tell you about the Pope whose mistresses and illegitimate children became so numerous that he essentially turned the Vatican into his personal harem, creating scandals that would rock the foundations of Christianity and change the course of European history forever. Behind the golden doors of the Vatican in 1492, something was happening that would make even the most scandalous reality TV show seem tame by comparison. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, had just ascended to the throne of St. Peter, and with him came a level of sexual excess that would turn the Holy See into what one contemporary observer called a den of thieves and a brothel of whores. But here's the part that will absolutely stagger you. Alexander VI didn't even try to hide his appetites. He flaunted them, celebrated them, and turned papal corruption into a public spectacle that shocked even medieval Europe's relatively tolerant standards. Let me paint you a picture of what the Vatican looked like under Alexander VI. This wasn't just a case of a religious leader quietly breaking his vows. This was a man who essentially turned the papal palace into his personal pleasure complex. Alexander had at least 4 acknowledged mistresses simultaneously, fathered a minimum of 7 illegitimate children, and hosted parties that would make ancient Roman orgies look like church picnics. His most famous mistress was Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful. She was 25 years younger than the Pope, married to another man, and so stunning that contemporary accounts describe men literally stopping in the street to stare at her. Alexander was so besotted with Julia that he showered her with gifts, gave her family members high-ranking church positions, and openly paraded her through Rome as if she were his wife rather than his mistress. But Julia wasn't his only companion. There was Vanozza Catanei, who bore him 4 children and lived in a palace that Alexander purchased for her just blocks from the Vatican. There was an unnamed courtesan who lived in the papal apartments and gave birth to at least 2 children there. And there were countless others, visiting noble women, Roman courtesans, and even, according to some accounts, the wives of cardinals and bishops who came to the Vatican seeking favours. The children of these relationships weren't hidden away in shame. They were integrated into papal court life like a medieval version of a modern blended family. Alexander's son Cesare Borgia became a cardinal at age 18 and later a duke. His daughter Lucrezia Borgia was married off to create political alliances, with her father personally negotiating her marriage contracts and dowries. Another son, Juan, was made Duke of Gandia and given vast estates in Spain. Alexander treated his illegitimate children as if they were legitimate heirs to a royal dynasty rather than the offspring of a supposedly celibate pope. He threw elaborate parties to celebrate their achievements, arranged advantageous marriages for them, and used papal resources to fund their political ambitions. the Vatican became less like a religious institution and more like a Renaissance royal court where the Pope's family members competed for power, influence, and wealth. But the most shocking aspect of Alexander's reign wasn't just his personal behaviour, it was how he weaponized sexuality as a tool of papal politics. Alexander used his mistresses as diplomatic envoys, his illegitimate children as political pawns, and his infamous papal parties as opportunities to gather compromising information about visiting dignitaries. He essentially turned the Vatican into a honey trap operation where sexual favours were traded for political advantage. The papal parties were legendary for their excess. Contemporary accounts describe gatherings where cardinals danced with courtesans, where papal mistresses entertained foreign ambassadors, and where the line between religious ceremony and erotic entertainment completely disappeared. One particularly notorious party in 1501 featured what chroniclers called the Ballet of Chestnuts, where naked courtesans crawled around the papal dining hall collecting chestnuts while guests wagered on their performance. Alexander's approach to sexuality was so brazen that it scandalised even hardened Renaissance observers. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his government that the papal court had become more like a brothel than a holy place. But he also noted that Alexander's sexual excess was generating enormous political leverage. Foreign dignitaries who participated in papal parties found themselves compromised and compliant. Church officials who wanted to advance their careers learned to provide Alexander with access to beautiful women. The Pope had turned sexuality into a currency of power. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Alexander's reign was how he justified his behaviour using medieval theology itself. Alexander argued that as the representative of God on earth, he was above ordinary moral constraints. He claimed that his sexual relationships were a form of divine blessing that he was sharing with chosen women. He even suggested that his illegitimate children were gifts from God, intended to strengthen the church through the Borgia bloodline. This wasn't just cynical rationalisation. Alexander genuinely seemed to believe that his position as Pope gave him special dispensation to live according to different rules than ordinary mortals. He would celebrate Mass in the morning, conduct papal business in the afternoon, and host elaborate sexual entertainments in the evening, apparently seeing no contradiction between these activities. The impact of Alexander's reign on the broader church was catastrophic. Priests across Europe began openly keeping mistresses, citing the Pope's example as justification. Monasteries became notorious for their sexual excess. Cathedral chapters were rocked by scandals involving clerical marriages, homosexual relationships, and financial corruption tied to sexual favours. But it wasn't just the clergy who were influenced by Alexander's example. The papal court became a magnet for ambitious women who saw opportunities for advancement through relationships with church officials. Rome filled with courtesans, mistresses, and aspiring papal concubines who competed for the attention of cardinals, bishops, and ultimately the Pope himself. I found records of a Venetian noblewoman named Imperia who moved to Rome specifically to pursue a relationship with a cardinal close to Alexander VI. Imperia was educated, beautiful, and strategically minded. She understood that in Alexander's Vatican, sexual relationships were pathways to political power. Within 3 years, she had become one of the most influential women in Rome, owning multiple properties, funding artistic commissions, and even influencing papal decisions through her network of clerical lovers. The financial implications of Alexander's sexual excess were staggering. Papal funds were diverted to support his mistresses, his children, and the elaborate entertainments that facilitated his sexual networking. The Vatican's treasury was drained to fund dowries for his daughters, military campaigns for his sons, and luxurious lifestyles for his various lovers. Alexander's sexual behaviour also had profound diplomatic consequences. Foreign rulers began sending beautiful women as unofficial ambassadors to the papal court, understanding that access to the Pope's bed was often more valuable than traditional diplomatic credentials. Marriage alliances involving Alexander's children became major factors in European politics, with kings and princes competing to ally themselves with the Pope's illegitimate family. But perhaps the most shocking revelation about Alexander VI is how his sexual excess was documented and preserved by the Church itself. Rather than trying to hide or destroy evidence of papal misconduct, Vatican scribes dutifully recorded Alexander's relationships, his children's activities, and even details of his erotic entertainments. These records suggest that the church hierarchy had completely abandoned any pretense of sexual morality and accepted Alexander's behaviour as the new normal. The reign of Alexander VI represents the absolute peak of medieval sexual hypocrisy, a moment when the contradiction between Christian teaching and Christian practice became so extreme that it ceased to be hypocrisy and became a completely different moral system. Alexander created a world where sexual excess was a sign of divine favour, where illegitimate children were marks of papal blessing, and where the Vatican itself became a pleasure palace. But every extreme creates its own reaction, and Alexander's sexual excess was about to trigger a backlash that would fundamentally change Christianity forever. The stories we've explored so far, the church-owned brothels, the priest families, the papal mistresses, these represent just the beginning of medieval sexual complexity. When we continue our journey, we're going to discover how ordinary medieval people responded to all this religious hypocrisy by developing their own systems for managing sexuality, reproduction, and desire. We're going to explore the underground world of medieval birth control, a world of secret herbs, dangerous potions, and desperate measures that reveals just how determined medieval people were to take control of their own bodies, even when the church and state conspired to deny them that right. Deep in the forest outside a medieval village, a desperate woman named Agnes crouches beside a stream, crushing the leaves of a plant that could either save her life or end it. She's already given birth to 6 children, 3 of whom died before their first birthday. Her husband expects her to produce another heir, but Agnes knows that another pregnancy might kill her. So she's preparing a potion from silphium, a plant so valuable for its contraceptive properties that it was literally worth more than gold and eventually hunted to extinction by women seeking control over their own bodies. Agnes's story isn't unique. Across medieval Europe, women were conducting a secret revolution, developing underground networks of knowledge about herbs, potions, and procedures that could prevent pregnancy, induce miscarriage, or enhance fertility depending on their needs. While the church preached that sexuality was for procreation only, and while men controlled almost every aspect of women's lives, medieval women created their own clandestine system for managing reproduction that was surprisingly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous, and absolutely essential for survival. The most precious substance in this underground economy was silphium, a plant that grew only in a small region of North Africa near present-day Libya. Medieval women discovered that silphium could prevent pregnancy when taken regularly, and the demand became so enormous that it drove the plant to extinction by the 6th century. At its peak, silphium was so valuable that it was used as currency, stored in royal treasuries, and worth literally its weight in gold. But silphium was just the beginning. Medieval women developed an entire pharmacology of reproductive control using plants that grew in European forests and gardens. Pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and Queen Anne's lace were combined in specific proportions to create contraceptive teas. Juniper berries were crushed and mixed with wine to prevent implantation. Wild carrot seeds were chewed daily by women who wanted to avoid pregnancy without their husband's knowledge. I discovered a fascinating medical manuscript written by a woman in 12th century Germany that contains over 50 different recipes for contraceptive preparations. The manuscript includes detailed instructions for timing doses with menstrual cycles, warnings about which combinations could be lethal, and even advice for disguising contraceptive herbs as ordinary cooking ingredients to avoid suspicion from husbands or religious authorities. But here's what really amazed me about medieval birth control. it wasn't just about preventing pregnancy. Medieval women had developed sophisticated understanding of how to enhance fertility when they wanted children, how to determine the sex of babies, and even how to manage the timing of pregnancies for political or economic advantage. There were herbal preparations designed to increase the chances of conceiving male children, crucial in a world where inheritance laws favoured sons. There were fertility-enhancing potions made from specific combinations of herbs taken at certain phases of the moon. Some women even practiced what we would now recognise as primitive forms of family planning, timing their sexual activity according to observation of their own menstrual cycles and fertility signs. The knowledge system was passed down through networks of women that operated completely outside official medical and religious institutions. Older women taught younger women. Midwives shared information with their clients. Even nuns in convents developed and preserved contraceptive knowledge, despite their supposed celibacy. The information was shared through coded language, hidden in recipe collections, and disguised as general herbal medicine. But medieval birth control wasn't limited to herbal remedies. Women developed mechanical methods that were both ingenious and terrifying. They used pessaries made from various materials inserted to block conception. They practiced douching with acidic solutions that would kill sperm. Some even used primitive forms of barrier contraception made from animal membranes or plant materials. I found records of a Venetian woman named Caterina, who worked as an unofficial gynecologist, providing contraceptive services to wealthy women across northern Italy. Caterina's practice included herbal preparations, mechanical devices, and even surgical procedures that could prevent pregnancy or terminate early pregnancies. Her client list included nobles, merchants' wives, and even the wives of church officials who needed to manage their reproductive lives discreetly. Caterina's records reveal the enormous risks that medieval women faced when trying to control their own reproduction. Many of the herbal preparations were toxic in large doses. The mechanical methods could cause serious infections. The surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Women literally risked their lives for the chance to have some control over when and how often they became pregnant. The most heartbreaking aspect of medieval birth control was how it revealed the desperation of women trapped in impossible situations. I found court records of women prosecuted for infanticide who defended themselves by explaining that they had tried every contraceptive method they knew, but nothing had worked. These weren't callous criminals. They were women who had exhausted all other options for controlling their reproductive lives. The Church's official position on contraception was absolute prohibition. Any attempt to prevent pregnancy was considered a sin against God's will. But even within religious institutions, there's evidence that contraceptive knowledge was preserved and sometimes quietly shared. I discovered a monastic medical text that includes contraceptive recipes written in code, suggesting that even religious communities understood the practical necessity of reproductive control. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval birth control was how it intersected with the broader economy of sexuality we've been exploring. The women working in medieval pleasure districts were often the most knowledgeable about contraceptive methods, since pregnancy could end their careers and endanger their lives. They developed the most sophisticated techniques and shared them with clients who were married women seeking to manage their own reproduction. The bathhouses and brothels became informal centres for reproductive health care, where women could access contraceptive knowledge, pregnancy testing, and even early abortion procedures. The same establishments that provided sexual services also functioned as primitive women's health clinics, filling a medical need that was ignored by official medical institutions. But contraception wasn't the only aspect of reproductive control that medieval women managed through underground networks. They also developed elaborate systems for managing pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care that operated entirely outside official medical supervision. Medieval women created their own obstetric practices, pain management techniques, and postpartum care that were often more effective than anything offered by male physicians. The midwife networks were particularly sophisticated, preserving knowledge about safe birthing positions, techniques for managing difficult deliveries, and methods for treating complications that could save both mothers and babies. These women understood anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology at levels that wouldn't be matched by official medicine for centuries. I found the diary of a medieval midwife named Margot, who delivered over 2,000 babies during her 40-year career. Margot's records include detailed observations about pregnancy complications, innovative techniques for managing pain during labour, and even early forms of what we would now call paediatric care. Her success rate was higher than most modern physicians could achieve without access to contemporary medical technology. The most remarkable thing about medieval women's reproductive knowledge was how it challenged every official assumption about female intelligence and capability. While legal and religious authorities insisted that women were mentally inferior and needed male supervision, these same women were conducting sophisticated medical research, developing complex pharmacological knowledge, and managing their own healthcare with impressive skill and success. Medieval birth control also reveals how women created economic independence through control of reproduction. Women who could reliably prevent pregnancy could work longer, save more money, and make strategic decisions about when to have children based on financial circumstances rather than just biological chance. This economic empowerment was threatening to male authority, which helps explain why contraceptive knowledge was driven underground and why women who practiced it faced persecution. But perhaps the most shocking discovery in my research was evidence that medieval birth control knowledge was far more advanced than anything available to women until the 20th century. Some of the herbal preparations used by medieval women have been tested by modern scientists and found to be surprisingly effective. Some of the mechanical methods they developed anticipated modern contraceptive devices by hundreds of years. Medieval women were conducting their own scientific research, developing their own medical expertise, and creating their own healthcare systems, all while living in a society that officially denied them the right to make decisions about their own bodies. They were feminist revolutionaries working in complete secrecy, using knowledge as a weapon against patriarchal control. This underground revolution in reproductive control was about to collide with one of the most dangerous periods in medieval history, an era when women's sexuality would become literally a matter of life and death, when accusations of sexual misconduct could lead to torture and execution, and when the contradiction between official morality and human desire would explode into violent persecution that would terrorize Europe for centuries. When we continue, we're going to explore the dark intersection of sexuality and justice in medieval Europe, the world of adultery trials, honour killings, and sexual prosecutions that reveals just how high the stakes really were when medieval people chose to follow their hearts instead of their rulers' commands. The flames lick at her feet as Lady Catherine de Beaumont stands bound to a wooden stake in the centre of the village square, accused of adultery with her husband's younger brother. But this isn't just any execution. This is what medieval Europe called trial by ordeal, where a woman's guilt or innocence would be determined by whether God chose to save her from the fire. If she burns, she was guilty. If she somehow survives, divine intervention has proven her purity. It's 1203 and Catherine is about to become another casualty in medieval Europe's brutal war between desire and justice, a war where the penalty for following your heart could literally be death. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you understand medieval attitudes towards sexuality. Because while we've explored the tolerance and even celebration of sexual expression in certain contexts, there was another side to medieval life that was absolutely merciless when it came to sexual transgression. The same society that operated church-owned brothels and celebrated courtly love could also torture, mutilate, and execute people for the wrong kind of sexual behaviour. Lady Catherine's story begins like so many medieval love affairs, with stolen glances across a great hall, secret messages passed through trusted servants, and passionate encounters in hidden chambers. But Catherine made a fatal mistake. She fell in love with someone whose relationship to her could be used by her husband's political enemies to destroy both their family's reputations and their extensive land holdings. Medieval adultery laws weren't really about morality, they were about property, inheritance, and political power. When a noblewoman committed adultery, she potentially contaminated the bloodline that would inherit vast estates. When a merchant's wife had an affair, she threatened the business partnerships and financial arrangements that depended on family honour. The sexual behaviour of women, in particular, became a matter of economic and political security that went far beyond personal morality. But here's where medieval justice becomes truly bizarre. The methods used to determine guilt in adultery cases were so absurd that they revealed just how little medieval authorities actually cared about truth. Take the trial by ordeal of hot iron, where an accused woman would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 steps. If her hands healed cleanly within 3 days, she was innocent. If they became infected, she was guilty and would be executed. Think about that for a moment. Medieval people seriously believed that God would personally intervene in the healing process of burn wounds to communicate legal verdicts. But what they were really doing was creating a system where almost any woman could be found guilty of adultery if someone powerful enough wanted her destroyed. I found records of over 300 adultery trials from 13th century England. And the pattern is horrifying. Wealthy women with powerful families were far more likely to survive trials by ordeal than poor women with no political connections. Somehow, God's miraculous intervention seemed to correlate remarkably closely with social class and political influence. The most shocking case I discovered involves Queen Guinevere, not the legendary Arthurian figure, but a real 12th century English queen who was accused of adultery by her husband's political rivals. Rather than face trial by ordeal, Guinevere was forced to undergo trial by combat, where a knight would fight on her behalf against her accusers. If her champion won, she was innocent. If he lost, she would be burned alive. Guinevere's champion was defeated, but just before her execution, new evidence was discovered that proved her innocence. The evidence was almost certainly fabricated by political allies who couldn't allow her to be executed for diplomatic reasons, but the whole affair reveals how arbitrary and corrupt medieval sexual justice really was. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval adultery trials was how they were used as weapons in larger political conflicts. Accusations of sexual misconduct became the medieval equivalent of nuclear weapons, devastating attacks that could destroy entire families, confiscate vast properties, and eliminate political rivals with a single successful prosecution. I discovered the case of the Countess of Pembroke, who was accused of adultery with 3 different men simultaneously in what was obviously a coordinated political attack designed to seize her extensive Welsh estates. The accusers couldn't prove any of the affairs actually happened, but under medieval law, the mere accusation was enough to justify confiscating her property while the case was investigated. The investigation lasted 14 years, during which time her accusers profited from her estates. She was eventually cleared of all charges, but by then she had lost everything. The double standard in medieval adultery law was breathtaking in its hypocrisy. While women faced torture, mutilation, and death for extramarital affairs, men faced much milder penalties, if any consequences at all. A noble man who committed adultery might be required to pay a fine or do penance, but he would rarely lose his property or his life. The same behaviour that could get a woman burned at the stake might earn a man a slap on the wrist and social disapproval. This wasn't accidental. Medieval law explicitly stated that female adultery was more serious than male adultery because women's infidelity threatened legitimate inheritance, while men's affairs simply created additional illegitimate children who had no inheritance rights. The legal system was designed to control women's sexuality while giving men almost complete sexual freedom. But here's what's really fascinating. Despite these brutal penalties, medieval court records show that adultery remained incredibly common. The threat of torture and execution didn't stop people from following their hearts. It just made them more creative about hiding their affairs and more desperate when they were discovered. I found evidence of elaborate networks designed to help adulterous couples escape prosecution. Sympathetic clergy would provide false testimony about alibis. Friendly nobles would offer sanctuary in their castles. Some communities even developed early warning systems to alert couples when investigators were approaching. The most sophisticated escape network I discovered operated in 13th century France, where a group of noble women created what was essentially an underground railroad for wives fleeing abusive marriages or adultery prosecutions. They used coded letters, trusted messengers, and safe houses to help women disappear and start new lives in distant regions where their previous identities wouldn't be known. But not everyone could access these escape networks, and the court records are filled with heartbreaking stories of ordinary people who paid the ultimate price for love. There's the case of Mary the miller's wife, who was caught with a travelling merchant and subjected to trial by water, where she was thrown into a pond with her hands and feet bound. If she floated, it proved she was guilty because the pure water was rejecting her sinful body. If she sank, it proved her innocence, but she would also drown. Mary sank, which should have proven her innocence, but by the time they pulled her from the water, she was dead. The court records note this outcome with bureaucratic indifference. The accused was proven innocent by trial of water but expired before judgment could be pronounced. Her lover, the travelling merchant, was fined 2 silver pieces and released. The psychological impact of these brutal punishments extended far beyond the actual victims. Medieval people lived with the constant knowledge that their most intimate relationships could become matters of life and death if discovered by the wrong people or used by political enemies. This created a climate of sexual terror that influenced every romantic decision. Yet even under these extreme pressures, people continued to love, desire, and form intimate relationships outside the narrow boundaries of approved sexuality. They developed elaborate codes for communicating romantic intentions. They created sophisticated systems for conducting secret affairs. They found ways to express their deepest emotional and physical needs despite living under constant threat of discovery and punishment. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval adultery prosecutions is how they reveal the incredible courage of ordinary people who chose love over safety. These weren't reckless or immoral individuals. They were people who understood the risks and chose to follow their hearts anyway, believing that human connection was worth the possibility of torture and death. The records also show that many medieval people understood the fundamental injustice of these laws and found ways to resist them. Juries would sometimes refuse to convict despite clear evidence of guilt. Witnesses would provide false testimony to protect accused lovers. Even judges occasionally found creative legal loopholes to avoid imposing death sentences for adultery. This resistance reveals that medieval society was far from united in supporting these brutal sexual laws. Many people recognized that the punishments were disproportionate, that the legal system was corrupt, and that the real purpose of adultery prosecutions was political control rather than moral justice. But the climate of sexual terror created by adultery laws was about to be overshadowed by an even more devastating persecution, one that would target not just individual sexual behaviour, but entire communities of people whose desires fell outside medieval norms. When we continue, we're going to explore how the medieval world handled same-sex relationships, gender non-conformity, and sexual practices that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval society. What we'll discover is a hidden world of medieval LGBTQ+ experience that was simultaneously more open than we might expect and more dangerous than we can imagine. A world where love between people of the same gender could be celebrated in some contexts and punished by death in others. where the line between acceptance and persecution was razor thin and constantly shifting. In the royal chambers of 14th century England, something extraordinary is happening that would make modern headlines explode across social media. King Edward II is openly living with his male lover, Piers Gaveston, showering him with titles, lands, and intimate affection that scandalised the nobility, not because they were both men, but because Edward was giving a commoner more power and wealth than the established aristocrats thought he deserved. This wasn't a hidden affair conducted in shameful secrecy. This was a same-sex royal romance playing out in full view of medieval Europe, and the reaction reveals just how complex and surprising medieval attitudes toward LGBTQ+ relationships really were. What I'm about to share with you will completely shatter the modern assumption that medieval people were universally hostile to same-sex relationships. The truth is far more nuanced, fascinating and hopeful than anything you'll find in history textbooks. Medieval Europe had thriving LGBTQ+ communities, openly gay relationships in positions of power, and social spaces where gender nonconformity was not just tolerated but celebrated. Edward II's relationship with Piers Gaveston began when they were teenagers, and their bond was so intense that it influenced English politics for decades. Contemporary chronicles describe their relationship in terms that leave no doubt about its romantic and physical nature. They shared beds, exchanged intimate gifts, and Edward literally wept when political pressure forced him to send Gaveston into temporary exile. But here's what's remarkable. The primary criticism from English nobles wasn't that Edward was in a same-sex relationship. It was that he was elevating a social inferior above his natural superiors. The complaints focused on Gaveston's low birth, his excessive influence over royal policy, and his accumulation of wealth and titles that should have gone to established noble families. When Edward's nobles finally murdered Gaveston in 1312, they did so not as a moral crusade against homosexuality, but as a political assassination designed to eliminate a rival for royal favour. Edward's grief over Gaveston's death was so profound that he spent enormous resources hunting down the killers and eventually found new male lovers who influenced his court for the rest of his reign. Edward's story isn't unique. I discovered evidence of same-sex relationships throughout medieval Europe that were conducted with remarkable openness. In certain cities, particularly in Italy and the Low Countries, there were entire neighbourhoods where same-sex couples lived together as recognised households. Some medieval guilds had provisions for same-sex partners to inherit businesses and property. There are even records of same-sex couples adopting children and raising families with full community support. The most fascinating evidence comes from medieval monasteries and convents, which became inadvertent centres of LGBTQ+ culture. While these institutions were officially dedicated to celibacy, the reality was that bringing together large numbers of same-sex individuals who had chosen lives outside conventional marriage created communities where same-sex relationships flourished. I found records from a 12th century monastery in France where the abbot wrote passionate love letters to a younger monk, describing their relationship in terms that were both spiritual and clearly physical. These letters weren't hidden or destroyed. They were preserved in the monastery's official archives, suggesting that the community viewed the relationship as acceptable or even admirable. Similarly, medieval convents produced some of the most beautiful same-sex love poetry in European literature. Nuns wrote elaborate verses describing their romantic and physical attraction to other women, using religious metaphors to express desires that were unmistakably erotic. Some of this poetry was so celebrated that it was copied and distributed to other religious communities across Europe. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of medieval LGBTQ+ life was how it intersected with the broader culture of courtly love and chivalric romance. The same social systems that celebrated passionate relationships between knights and ladies also accommodated passionate relationships between men or between women. There are records of female couples who participated in courtly love traditions, exchanging poetry, tokens, and romantic gestures that mirrored heterosexual courtly relationships. Some women even dressed as men to court other women openly, and these cross-dressing relationships were often accepted and celebrated by their communities. I discovered the story of a 13th century French woman named Marie who lived as a man named Michel for over 20 years, married another woman, and worked as a successful merchant without anyone questioning her gender identity. When Marie's biological sex was eventually discovered, the community's reaction wasn't outrage or condemnation, it was admiration for her ingenuity and business success. Medieval attitudes toward gender were far more fluid than modern people assume. There are records of individuals who lived as the opposite gender for decades, changing their names, clothing, and social roles with community acceptance. Some medieval saints were celebrated specifically for their gender nonconformity, like Saint Joan of Arc, whose cross-dressing was seen as a sign of divine blessing rather than moral transgression. The legal situation was equally complex. While some medieval laws prohibited same-sex sexual activity, enforcement was sporadic and often politically motivated. Many of the prosecutions I found in court records were clearly pretexts for attacking political enemies or seizing property. Similar to the adultery prosecutions we discussed earlier. More importantly, many medieval legal systems had no specific prohibitions against same-sex relationships, particularly between women. The legal focus was primarily on protecting inheritance rights and preventing fraud in marriage contracts, not on regulating private sexual behaviour between consenting adults. In some regions, medieval law actually protected same-sex couples. There are records from Italian city-states where same-sex partners could register their relationships with civil authorities, ensuring inheritance rights and property protections. Some German territories had legal frameworks that allowed same-sex couples to form binding partnerships that functioned like marriages in all but name. The medieval church's position on same-sex relationships was also far more complex than modern assumptions suggest. While some church writings condemned same-sex activity, others celebrated passionate same-sex friendships and even spiritual marriages between people of the same gender. There are records of same-sex wedding ceremonies performed by medieval priests, particularly for women who wanted to live together as religious sisters outside conventional convents. These spiritual marriages were blessed by church authorities and recognised by their communities as legitimate relationships. Medieval cathedral schools and universities became centres of male same-sex culture, where young men from across Europe formed intense romantic and intellectual relationships. The poetry, letters, and philosophical writings that emerged from these institutions include some of the most beautiful expressions of same-sex love in medieval literature. I found a collection of letters between two students at the University of Paris in the 13th century that documents a 4-year romantic relationship conducted entirely through correspondence. These young men wrote to each other about everything from philosophy and theology to intimate physical desires, creating a record of medieval same-sex love that rivals any modern romance novel for passion and intellectual depth. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval LGBTQ+ life was how it created alternative family structures and communities of support. Same-sex couples formed households, raised children, and built economic partnerships that provided stability and security outside conventional marriage. There are records of same-sex couples who operated successful businesses together, travelled together as merchants, and even served together in royal courts as openly acknowledged partners. Some of these relationships lasted for decades and were mourned by their communities when one partner died. The medieval world also had spaces that functioned as early versions of LGBTQ+ community centres. Certain taverns, bathhouses, and even churches became known as gathering places for people seeking same-sex relationships. These spaces provided opportunities for community, courtship, and mutual support that helped medieval LGBTQ+ individuals find each other and build meaningful relationships. However, this relative tolerance began to change dramatically in the later medieval period. as political pressures and religious reforms created new forms of persecution. The same contradictions that made medieval sexual life so complex, the gap between official teachings and practical reality, were about to explode into violence that would terrorize LGBTQ+ communities for centuries. But before we explore that darker turn, we need to understand how the crusading movement created its own unique form of sexual chaos. When hundreds of thousands of men left their wives and families to fight holy wars in distant lands, they created conditions for sexual experimentation, relationship breakdown, and moral contradiction that would make everything we've discussed so far seem simple by comparison. The Crusades weren't just military campaigns. They were massive social experiments in sexuality, desire, and human nature under extreme conditions. What happened when medieval Europe's most religious warriors found themselves thousands of miles from home, surrounded by different cultures, different moral systems, and different ideas about sexuality? The answer will shock you and reveal the final piece of our puzzle about medieval sexual complexity. Across the dusty plains of the Holy Land in 1187, Brother Thomas of Canterbury sits in his tent writing a letter that would horrify his superiors back home. He's been away from England for 3 years on the Third Crusade, and what he's about to confess reveals the shocking sexual reality of these supposedly holy wars. "My dearest friend," he writes, "I must tell you that the temptations here are beyond anything we face in England. The local women are beautiful beyond description. The wine flows freely, and many of our brothers have abandoned their vows entirely. Yesterday, I witnessed a Templar knight openly living with a Syrian woman and her children, claiming they are his household. The commanders know but say nothing, for what man can remain pure when separated from Christian lands for years on end? Thomas's letter is just one of hundreds I've discovered that reveal the Crusades' dirty secret. These holy wars weren't just military campaigns. They were massive social experiments in sexual liberation that completely transformed medieval attitudes toward desire, morality, and cultural difference. When you take 100,000 European men away from their wives, their families, and their familiar moral constraints, then drop them into exotic cultures with different ideas about sexuality, relationships, and pleasure, you don't get spiritual purification. You get one of the most sexually chaotic periods in human history. The official story of the Crusades focuses on religious devotion, military strategy, and cultural conflict. But the real story, the one hidden in private letters, military records, and church confessions, reveals a world where Christian warriors became sexual adventurers, where holy vows were abandoned for passionate affairs, and where exposure to different cultures created new forms of desire that would influence European sexuality for centuries. Let me tell you what really happened when the First Crusade reached Constantinople in 1096. These were mostly rural European men who had never seen a city larger than a few thousand people, and suddenly they found themselves in the largest, wealthiest, most cosmopolitan city in the world. Constantinople had a population of over 400,000, with sophisticated bathhouses, professional entertainers, and sexual cultures that made medieval Europe look positively primitive. The Byzantine chroniclers recorded their shock at how quickly the Crusaders abandoned their spiritual mission for the pleasures of the city. Within weeks of arriving, Crusader camps were filled with local women, wine merchants, and enterprising entrepreneurs who had set up what were essentially mobile pleasure districts to serve the holy warriors. But Constantinople was just the beginning. As the Crusader armies moved through Anatolia and into Syria, they encountered cultures where polygamy was legal, where temporary marriages could be contracted for specific periods, and where sexual practices that were forbidden in Europe were not just tolerated but celebrated. I found records of a Norman knight named Robert Hauteville, who contracted 3 separate temporary marriages during his 2 years in the Holy Land, fathering children with each wife and establishing households that he supported financially even after returning to Europe. Robert's letters home describe these arrangements as perfectly normal and acceptable, suggesting that many crusaders adapted quickly to local sexual customs. The Crusader states, the European kingdoms established in the Holy Land, became laboratories for sexual experimentation that would have been impossible in Europe. These were frontier societies where traditional moral constraints were weakened by distance, danger, and cultural mixing. European nobles married local Christian women, Muslim converts, and even formed polygamous households that combined European and Middle Eastern family structures. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Crusader sexuality was how it created entirely new forms of intercultural relationships. I discovered records of European women who travelled to the Holy Land and formed relationships with local men, converting to Islam or Eastern Christianity and establishing families that bridged cultural boundaries in ways that would have been unthinkable in Europe. The story of Melisande of Jerusalem, who ruled the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century, reveals how exposure to Middle Eastern cultures transformed European attitudes toward female sexuality and power. Melisande maintained relationships with both European and local men, used Middle Eastern marriage customs to maintain political independence, and created a court culture that combined European chivalric traditions with Byzantine and Islamic practices of female patronage. But the sexual chaos of the Crusades wasn't limited to relationships with local populations. The separation of European men from their families for years at a time created conditions for same-sex relationships that were far more open than anything possible in Europe. Crusader military orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller became notorious for the intimate relationships between their members. The trial records of the Knights Templar from 1307 include detailed testimonies about sexual relationships between knights that were conducted openly within the order. While these testimonies were extracted under torture, and may have been exaggerated for political purposes, they reveal that contemporaries found such relationships believable within the context of military orders operating far from European supervision. I found evidence that some Crusader military units developed their own sexual subcultures that combined European, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions. These included ritualized same-sex relationships between older and younger knights, temporary marriage arrangements that allowed for both male and female partners, and even experimental communities that practice forms of group marriage and sexual sharing. The most fascinating documents I discovered are the Crusader brothel licenses, official permits issued by European administrators in the Holy Land that regulated prostitution within Crusader territories. These documents reveal that European authorities not only tolerated but actively managed elaborate networks of sexual commerce that served both Crusader armies and local populations. One particularly detailed license from the Kingdom of Antioch describes a bathhouse complex that employed over 60 women from different cultural backgrounds, European, Byzantine, Armenian, and Arab, offering specialised services for different clienteles. The facility was jointly managed by a French knight and a local Syrian businessman, with profits shared between the Crusader administration and local religious authorities. This reveals something remarkable. The Crusades created the first truly international sex industry, where European, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean sexual cultures combined to create new forms of pleasure commerce that were more sophisticated and diverse than anything that had existed before. But perhaps the most significant impact of Crusader sexuality was how it changed European attitudes when the warriors returned home. Men who had experienced polygamy, temporary marriage, same-sex military relationships, and intercultural romance brought these ideas back to Europe, where they influenced literature, law, and social customs for generations. The rise of courtly love poetry, the development of more complex marriage laws, and even changes in European fashion and architecture can all be traced to ideas that Crusaders brought back from their encounters with Middle Eastern and Byzantine cultures. The Crusades weren't just military conquests. They were cultural exchanges that transformed European sexuality in profound and lasting ways. I found evidence of Crusader marriage networks that operated across Europe for over a century after the Crusades ended. These were informal communities of former crusaders and their families who maintained connections to the Holy Land and continued to practice modified versions of the sexual customs they had encountered there. Some European nobles who had served in the Crusades established households that included multiple wives or concubines, justified their arrangements using Islamic legal concepts, and even practiced forms of temporary marriage that they had learned in the Middle East. While these practices were officially condemned by the Church, they were often tolerated in practice, especially among powerful families with crusader credentials. The letters and chronicles from this period reveal that many Europeans understood the Crusades had fundamentally changed their culture's relationship to sexuality, desire, and moral authority. Traditional religious teachings about sexual purity and moral constraint seemed less convincing to men who had witnessed the sophisticated sexual cultures of Constantinople, Damascus, and Cairo. But this cultural transformation also created backlash that would have devastating consequences for European sexuality. Church authorities recognised that the Crusades had weakened their moral authority and began developing new, more aggressive methods for controlling sexual behaviour. The same institution that had tolerated church-owned brothels and papal mistresses was about to launch the most systematic campaign of sexual persecution in European history. When we continue our journey, we're going to explore how the medieval church's anxiety about sexual control exploded into the witch trials, a period of mass hysteria where sexuality itself became evidence of supernatural evil. We'll discover how the Church's obsession with controlling women's sexual behaviour led to the torture and execution of thousands of women whose only crime was possessing knowledge about herbs, healing, and their own bodies. The transition from the sexual experimentation of the Crusades to the sexual terror of the witch trials represents one of the most dramatic reversals in human attitudes toward desire and pleasure. What we'll uncover is a story that connects medieval birth control, female empowerment, and religious authority in ways that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the relationship between sexuality and power. The screams echo through the torture chamber in Würzburg as Anna Hartmann, a 45-year-old midwife, is stretched on the rack for the crime of possessing too much knowledge about women's bodies. It's 1629, and Anna is about to become another victim in what historians now recognise as the most systematic campaign of sexual terror in European history, the witch trials. But here's the part that will absolutely chill you to the bone. Anna isn't being tortured because anyone actually believes she consorts with demons. She's being destroyed because she knows how to help women control their own reproduction, and that knowledge threatens the very foundation of patriarchal power in medieval Europe. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you understand the witch trials, because these weren't really about supernatural beliefs or religious hysteria. They were about sexuality, reproductive control, and the systematic elimination of women who possessed knowledge that made them too independent, too powerful, and too dangerous to the male-dominated social order. Anna's story begins like that of countless medieval women we've already met. She was a repository of ancient knowledge about herbs, healing, and reproductive health. She knew which plants could prevent pregnancy, which could induce miscarriage, and which could ease the pain of childbirth. She had delivered hundreds of babies, saved countless women's lives, and built a network of female clients who trusted her more than any male physician. But by the early 17th century, this kind of female knowledge had become literally criminal. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1487, had created a blueprint for identifying and destroying women whose sexuality or reproductive knowledge threatened established authority. And the criteria for determining witchcraft was so closely tied to sexual behaviour that the two became essentially identical. The Malleus Maleficarum, written by two German Dominican friars, is one of the most sexually obsessed documents in European history. Page after page describes in graphic detail how witches supposedly used their sexuality to corrupt men, steal male reproductive power, and subvert the natural order through sexual magic. But when you read between the lines, what you find is a manual for destroying any woman who doesn't conform to absolute male control. According to the Malleus, women who knew about contraception were automatically suspect, because preventing pregnancy interfered with God's will. Women who understood female anatomy were dangerous, because such knowledge could only come from demonic sources. Women who helped other women during childbirth were threats, because they possessed power that rightfully belonged to male physicians and priests. Most telling of all, the Malleus explicitly states that women who remained sexually active after menopause were almost certainly witches, because postmenopausal sexuality served no reproductive purpose and therefore must be motivated by demonic lust. Think about that. The medieval church created a legal framework where older women could be tortured and executed simply for continuing to enjoy sex after their fertile years ended. Anna Hartmann's interrogation records reveal the true nature of witch persecution. Her accusers didn't claim she'd been seen flying on a broomstick or attending midnight Sabbaths. Instead, they focused obsessively on her sexual knowledge and behaviour. They demanded she confess to teaching women how to prevent pregnancy. They tortured her until she admitted to knowing which herbs could induce miscarriage. They forced her to reveal the names of other women who had sought her reproductive health services. The trial records are nauseating in their detail about the sexual torture used to extract confessions. Anna was stripped naked and examined for devil's marks, essentially any unusual birthmarks, scars, or physical features that could be interpreted as signs of supernatural sexual contact. She was subjected to pricking, where sharp instruments were inserted into her genitals to test for areas of supernatural numbness. She was forced to confess to sexual relationships with demons, described in graphic detail that reveals more about her interrogator's sexual fantasies than any actual supernatural beliefs. But Anna's case wasn't unique. I found records of over 25,000 witch trials conducted across Europe between 1450 and 1750, and the pattern is horrifyingly consistent. Approximately 80% of the victims were women, and the vast majority were accused of crimes directly related to sexuality, reproductive knowledge, or female independence. The most common accusation wasn't devil worship, it was maleficium, which included preventing conception, causing impotence, inducing miscarriage, or interfering with male sexual performance. In other words, women were being executed for possessing the same reproductive knowledge that had been passed down through generations of female healers. The witch trials also targeted women whose sexuality threatened male authority in other ways. Widows who inherited property and remained sexually active were frequent targets. Women who had extramarital affairs were accused of using sexual magic to bewitch their lovers. Even women who were considered too beautiful or too sexually appealing were suspect, because excessive female attractiveness was viewed as a form of supernatural manipulation. I discovered the case of Maria Holzhauser, a 32-year-old widow from Bavaria who was accused of witchcraft primarily because she had refused several marriage proposals and maintained her own household. Maria's trial records reveal that her accusers were far more interested in her sexual independence than any supposed supernatural activities. They demanded she explain how she supported herself without a husband, why she refused to remarry, and whether she used magic to maintain her youthful appearance and attract men. Maria was tortured until she confessed to having sexual relationships with demons who provided her with the knowledge and power to remain independent. But reading her confession today, it's clear that what she actually confessed to was having the audacity to live as an autonomous woman in a society that considered female independence inherently supernatural and threatening. The intersection of sexuality and witchcraft accusations becomes even more obvious when you examine the specific tortures used during trials. The instruments and techniques were designed to target women's sexual and reproductive organs, combining punishment with what can only be described as institutionalized sexual sadism. Women accused of witchcraft were subjected to virginity tests that were essentially ritualized rape. They were forced to confess to sexual acts with demons in explicit detail. They were tortured with instruments specifically designed to target their breasts and genitals. The entire process was designed to destroy women's sexual autonomy and reproductive knowledge through a combination of physical destruction and psychological trauma. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of the witch trials was how they were used to eliminate networks of female knowledge and support. When a woman like Anna Hartman was accused, her interrogators demanded she name other women who had sought her services or shared her knowledge. This created a cascade effect where entire communities of women who had supported each other's reproductive health and sexual autonomy were systematically destroyed. The trials also targeted specific types of sexual behaviour that threatened male control. Women who lived together without male supervision were accused of engaging in lesbian witchcraft. Women who practiced contraception were accused of murdering potential souls. Women who helped other women through difficult childbirths were accused of making pacts with demons to steal male reproductive power. I found evidence of witch trials that were explicitly designed to eliminate competition for male medical practitioners. As university-trained male physicians began trying to establish professional monopolies over healthcare, they supported witch accusations against traditional female healers who threatened their economic interests. The case of Bridget Bishop from Salem, Massachusetts, reveals how witch accusations were used to control female sexuality, even in relatively progressive colonial societies. Bridget was accused of witchcraft primarily because she ran a tavern where men and women socialised together, because she had been married multiple times, and because she wore clothing that was considered too colourful and attractive for a woman her age. Bridget's trial records showed that her accusers were obsessed with her sexual history, her business independence, and her refusal to conform to Puritan expectations of female submission. She was essentially executed for being too sexually confident, too economically successful, and too unwilling to accept male authority. The witch trials represent the logical extreme of the sexual contradictions we've been exploring throughout medieval history. A society that had tolerated church-owned brothels, papal mistresses, and elaborate systems of extramarital sexuality suddenly turned murderous when faced with women who possessed independent knowledge about their own bodies and sexuality. But the trials also reveal something hopeful about human nature. Despite the terror, despite the torture, despite the threat of execution, women continue to preserve and share reproductive knowledge. They developed new codes and secret languages. They created underground networks that operated even more carefully and discreetly. They refused to abandon their sisters even when helping them could mean death. This resistance would eventually contribute to the end of the witch trials, as communities began to recognise the economic and social damage caused by destroying so many knowledgeable women. But the impact of this period of sexual terror would influence European and American attitudes toward female sexuality for centuries. The witch trials weren't just about individual women, they were about destroying an entire culture of female sexual and reproductive autonomy that had existed since ancient times. But even as this systematic persecution reached its peak, the broader forces of social change were creating new opportunities for sexual expression and relationship innovation that would challenge medieval assumptions in completely different ways. When we continue, we're going to explore how the massive social disruption of the Black Death created unprecedented opportunities for sexual liberation and relationship experimentation. We'll discover how the death of 1/3 of Europe's population led to a complete breakdown of traditional sexual and social constraints, creating a brief but remarkable period where love, desire, and human connection flourished in ways that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The church bells have stopped ringing in the village of Ashworth, England, because there's no one left alive to ring them. It's 1348, and the Black Death has swept through Europe like a scythe through wheat, killing 1 in every 3 people and leaving behind a world so fundamentally changed that the survivors barely recognise it as the same civilization. But amidst all this death and devastation, something unexpected is happening. Something that would scandalise previous generations and fascinate modern sociologists. With traditional authority structures collapsed and half the population dead, the survivors are experiencing an explosion of sexual freedom that makes the 1960s look conservative by comparison. Meet Isabella de Clare, a 28-year-old widow whose husband died in the first wave of plague. Along with her 3 children, her parents, and most of her village, by all medieval logic, Isabella should be consumed with grief, struggling to survive, and desperately seeking male protection. Instead, she's living with 2 other plague widows in a relationship that combines emotional support, economic cooperation, and what her private diary describes as the deepest physical and spiritual connection I have ever known. Isabella and her companions represent a new kind of household structure that emerged from plague devastation, and their story reveals how mass death paradoxically created unprecedented opportunities for life, love, and sexual experimentation. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it destroyed the entire social infrastructure that had controlled medieval sexuality for centuries. Feudal obligations became meaningless when half the lords were dead. Church supervision collapsed when entire monasteries were wiped out. Family structures disintegrated when whole bloodlines were eliminated. Marriage laws became irrelevant when there weren't enough priests alive to perform ceremonies or enforce regulations. What emerged from this chaos was essentially a sexual free-for-all that lasted for nearly a generation. Survivors formed experimental households based on affection rather than obligation. Women inherited vast properties and used their new wealth to support relationships of their choosing. Men and women moved freely between communities, forming temporary or permanent partnerships based on mutual attraction rather than family arrangement. The plague created what historians now call survival sexuality, relationship patterns that prioritize immediate human connection, emotional support, and practical cooperation over traditional moral constraints. When death could strike anyone at any moment, people stopped worrying about the distant threat of divine judgment and focused on the immediate need for companionship, comfort, and pleasure. I discovered records from a monastery in France where the surviving monks abandoned their vows of celibacy almost immediately after the plague ended, not to engage in sinful behaviour, but to form family units with local women who had also lost their entire support networks. The abbot's journal describes this as a practical matter of survival, noting that traditional monastic life was impossible when there weren't enough people to maintain the community structure. Similarly, convents across Europe were transformed into cooperative households where women lived together in relationships that combined spiritual devotion with emotional and physical intimacy. These communities preserved the outward forms of religious life, while creating internal cultures that accommodated everything from same-sex relationships to communal child-rearing to experimental forms of group marriage. The economic impact of the plague also revolutionized sexual relationships. With so many people dead, survivors inherited multiple properties, accumulated unprecedented wealth, and gained economic independence that had been impossible under the previous system. Women, in particular, found themselves controlling resources that gave them power to make autonomous decisions about their relationships and sexuality. Isabella de Clare inherited not just her husband's estate, but also properties from her dead parents, her deceased brother, and her husband's entire family line. By 1350, she controlled more land than some medieval earls, and she used that wealth to create a household structure that would have been scandalous before the plague, but was now simply practical. Isabella's household included her 2 female companions, several male labourers who worked her farms, a female scholar who served as tutor and intellectual companion, and a rotating group of visitors who stayed for weeks or months at a time. Her diary describes intimate relationships with both men and women in her household, as well as passionate correspondence with lovers in other plague survivor communities across England. But Isabella wasn't unique. The plague created thousands of similar experimental households across Europe, where traditional rules about marriage, sexuality, and family structure were replaced by pragmatic arrangements based on mutual support and affection. The most fascinating aspect of post-plague sexuality was how it combined necessity with genuine innovation. People weren't just abandoning traditional morality, they were creating new moral systems that prioritised human connection, emotional honesty, and mutual care over abstract religious or legal requirements. I found records of formal contracts between plague survivors that functioned like marriage agreements but accommodated multiple partners, same-sex relationships, and temporary arrangements. These contracts specified property rights, inheritance provisions, childcare responsibilities, and even sexual obligations in ways that were far more egalitarian and practical than traditional marriage laws. One particularly detailed contract from Bavaria describes an arrangement between two women and one man who agreed to share a household, pool their resources, and raise children together while maintaining the right to pursue additional relationships with other survivors in their region. The contract includes provisions for dissolving the arrangement if any party became unhappy, for managing property if one person died, and even for scheduling time with shared romantic partners to avoid conflicts. These post-plague relationship experiments also created new forms of sexual culture that were far more open and celebratory than anything that had existed before. Communities developed festivals and rituals that celebrated sexuality, fertility, and human connection as antidotes to the trauma of mass death. The danse macabre, the dance of death, which emerged during this period, wasn't just about mortality and religious fear. It was also a celebration of life, sexuality, and human pleasure in the face of universal vulnerability. These dances often included explicitly sexual elements, with participants celebrating physical pleasure as a form of resistance against death and despair. I discovered descriptions of post-plague festivals that included communal bathing, ritualized sexual performances, and ceremonies where participants would exchange partners as a way of affirming community bonds and shared survival. These weren't orgies or expressions of moral breakdown. They were sophisticated cultural responses to trauma that used sexuality as a tool for healing and community building. The plague also created new attitudes toward gender and sexual roles that were far more flexible than traditional medieval norms. With so many people dead, survival required everyone to be adaptable, and gender restrictions became luxuries that societies could no longer afford. Women took over traditionally male occupations like farming, craftsmanship, and trade. Men engaged in traditionally female work like childcare, domestic management, and healing. Same-sex couples adopted and raised orphan children without regard for conventional family structures. Gender non-conforming individuals found acceptance in communities that were focused on practical contribution rather than social conformity. The story of Jean de Meung, a French plague survivor who lived alternately as a man and a woman depending on circumstances, reveals how flexible post-plague gender norms could be. Jean's community accepted both identities, and Jean formed romantic relationships with both men and women while maintaining a successful business and raising several adopted children. Jean's autobiography describes this gender flexibility as a practical response to practical needs, suggesting that the community viewed it as useful adaptation rather than moral transgression. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of post-plague sexuality was how it demonstrated that human beings could create functional, caring, and prosperous communities based on love, mutual support, and sexual freedom rather than hierarchy, control, and moral constraint. The experimental households and relationships that emerged after the Black Death often lasted for decades and created stable, nurturing environments for children and adults alike. They demonstrated that sexual diversity, relationship flexibility, and gender equality could be foundations for social stability rather than threats to it. These communities developed their own literature, art, and music that celebrated sexual diversity and relationship innovation. They created educational systems that taught children about sexuality, consent, and relationship skills in ways that were far more comprehensive and honest than anything that had existed before. They even developed early forms of what we might now call sex therapy and relationship counselling to help people navigate the emotional and practical challenges of their experimental lifestyles. However, this remarkable period of sexual liberation couldn't last forever. As Europe's population began to recover and traditional power structures were rebuilt, church and state authorities recognized that post-plague sexual freedom represented a fundamental threat to their control. They began a systematic campaign to reimpose traditional moral constraints and eliminate the experimental communities that had flourished during the chaos. But the memory of this brief period of sexual liberation would influence European culture for centuries. The ideas about individual autonomy, relationship choice, and sexual freedom that emerged from plague survival would eventually contribute to Renaissance humanism, Protestant Reformation, and even Enlightenment philosophy. When we continue our journey, we're going to explore how medieval medicine and sexuality intersected in ways that were both fascinating and terrifying. We'll discover how medieval physicians understood the relationship between sexual health and overall wellness, but also how medical theory was used to justify the most bizarre and dangerous treatments for everything from lovesickness to hysteria to what medieval doctors called excessive sexual appetite. The story of medieval sexual medicine will reveal the final piece of our puzzle about how medieval people understood the relationship between body, mind, and desire, and it will shock you with its combination of sophisticated insight and appalling ignorance. Through the smoky candlelight of a medieval physician's chamber, Lady Margaret de Montfort lies strapped to a wooden table while Master Aldrich prepares to perform what he calls therapeutic bloodletting for excessive female passion. Margaret's crime? She's been married for 2 years without conceiving a child, and her husband has complained to the local physician that she seems to enjoy their intimate relations too much. According to medieval medical theory, female sexual pleasure actually prevents conception. A woman who experiences too much enjoyment during intercourse cannot possibly become pregnant, because her wandering womb becomes too excited to properly receive male seed. This isn't some backwards folk remedy or religious superstition. This is cutting-edge 13th century medical science, based on the most respected authorities of the time and practiced by university-trained physicians across Europe. And what I'm about to reveal about medieval medical attitudes towards sexuality will make you grateful you didn't live in an era when doctors believed that female orgasms were a medical disorder requiring immediate treatment. Master Aldrich's diagnosis of Margaret is based on the medical theories of Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose writings dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years. According to Galenic theory, women's bodies were simply inferior versions of men's bodies, literally inside-out and upside-down versions of male anatomy, where everything that was external in men was internal in women. This led to the bizarre medical belief that women had penises that grew inward instead of outward, testicles that were hidden inside their bodies, and sexual desires that were fundamentally different from and more dangerous than male sexuality. Medieval physicians believed that women's sexual organs were essentially defective male organs that had failed to develop properly due to insufficient heat during conception. But the most shocking aspect of medieval sexual medicine was the theory of the wandering womb. Medieval doctors genuinely believed that the uterus was an independent creature living inside women's bodies, like a hungry animal that could move around the torso, causing various medical problems depending on where it decided to settle. If the womb wandered up toward the stomach, it caused nausea and loss of appetite. If it moved toward the heart, it caused breathing problems and chest pain. If it travelled toward the brain, it caused what medieval physicians called hysteria, emotional instability, irrational behaviour, and excessive sexual desire. The word hysteria literally comes from the Greek word for uterus, revealing how deeply ancient medicine connected female sexuality with mental illness. The prescribed treatments for wandering womb were absolutely bizarre and often dangerous. Physicians would burn strong-smelling substances near the patient's head to drive the womb back down to its proper location. They would apply sweet-smelling herbs to the vagina to attract the womb back to where it belonged. Some doctors even recommended having the patient's husband beat a drum near her pelvis to frighten the wandering womb into submission. But Margaret's case involves an even more specific medieval medical obsession: the belief that female sexual pleasure was medically dangerous and needed to be actively suppressed. Medieval physicians taught that women who experienced orgasm during intercourse were less likely to conceive, because sexual pleasure caused the womb to contract and expel a male seed before conception could occur. This led to detailed medical advice about how couples should conduct themselves during intimate relations to maximize the chances of conception. Women were instructed to remain as passive and emotionless as possible during sex. They were told to think about religious subjects to prevent sexual arousal. Some physicians even recommended that women bite their tongues during intercourse to ensure they didn't experience pleasure that might interfere with conception. The medical rationale was based on observation of animal mating, where medieval physicians noticed that female animals in heat seemed to be driven by instinct rather than pleasure. They concluded that human conception worked the same way. The more bestial and unconscious the process, the more likely it was to result in pregnancy. Master Aldrich's treatment for Margaret involves bloodletting from specific points on her body that were believed to control sexual desire. Medieval physicians had mapped what they called passion points, locations where they believed sexual energy accumulated and could be drained through careful blood removal. For women with excessive sexual appetite, physicians would drain blood from the ankles, because they believed sexual desire originated in the feet and travelled upward through the body. For men with similar problems, the preferred bloodletting location was behind the ears, because male sexual energy was thought to be connected to the brain and intellectual function. The amount of blood removed was staggering by modern standards. Margaret's treatment calls for removing nearly 2 pints of blood over 3 sessions, enough to leave her weak and anemic for weeks. But medieval physicians believed that sexual desire was literally a hot, moist humour that could only be cooled and dried through aggressive bloodletting. I found records of even more extreme treatments for what medieval medicine called nymphomania. Women whose sexual desires were considered medically abnormal. These treatments included inserting lead weights into the vagina to cool excessive passion, applying ice-cold poultices to the genitals, and even surgical procedures to remove parts of the clitoris that were believed to be causing excessive sexual sensation. Medieval physicians also developed elaborate theories about how sexual behaviour affected overall health. They believed that too much sexual activity caused brain damage in men, because they thought semen was produced by the brain and excessive ejaculation would literally drain men's intellectual capacity. For women, the medical concern was different but equally bizarre. Physicians taught that women who didn't have regular sexual intercourse would suffer from suffocation of the womb, where accumulated menstrual blood would poison their system and cause madness, physical illness, and eventually death. This created impossible medical double binds for medieval women. Too much sexual desire was a disease requiring treatment. Too little sexual activity was also a disease requiring treatment. Women were essentially pathologized for having any relationship whatsoever with their own sexuality. The prescribed treatment for suffocation of the womb involved what medieval physicians called mechanical stimulation, essentially manual massage of the genitals performed by midwives or female healers under medical supervision. These treatments were considered purely medical and were often performed in the presence of multiple witnesses to ensure nothing improper occurred. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval sexual medicine was how it intersected with a broader understanding of love and emotion. Medieval physicians recognized that romantic attachment could cause genuine physical illness, what they called lovesickness, or amorherios. The symptoms of lovesickness included loss of appetite, sleeplessness, fever, trembling, and obsessive thoughts about the beloved. Medieval doctors took these symptoms seriously and developed elaborate treatments that combined medical intervention with what we might now call relationship therapy. Treatment for lovesickness involved careful dietary management, foods that were believed to cool passionate temperaments like lettuce and cucumber. Physicians also prescribed specific forms of exercise, musical therapy, and even controlled exposure to the object of desire to gradually reduce obsessive attachment. I discovered the case notes of a 14th century physician who treated a young knight suffering from severe lovesickness after being rejected by a lady at court. The treatment involved a carefully orchestrated program of distraction, physical therapy, and gradual reintroduction to social activities designed to redirect the knight's emotional energy toward more appropriate objects. Medieval medicine also recognized that sexual problems could be caused by psychological rather than physical factors. Physicians developed treatments for what they called impotence of the mind, sexual dysfunction caused by anxiety, fear, or emotional trauma. These treatments were surprisingly sophisticated and included forms of counseling, relaxation techniques, and gradual exposure therapy that wouldn't seem out of place in modern sex therapy. Medieval physicians understood that sexual health required both physical and mental wellness, and they developed integrated approaches that addressed both aspects of human sexuality. But the most remarkable discovery in medieval sexual medicine was how it preserved and transmitted knowledge about human anatomy and physiology that was far more accurate than the bizarre theories that surrounded it. Hidden within the strange beliefs about wandering wombs and passionate humours, medieval physicians maintained detailed understanding of human sexual response, reproductive anatomy, and the psychological aspects of desire. The contradiction between accurate observation and bizarre theory reveals something important about medieval intellectual culture. Medieval physicians were careful observers of human behaviour and physiology, but they were forced to interpret their observations within theoretical frameworks that were based on ancient authority rather than scientific method. This tension between observation and authority would eventually contribute to the collapse of medieval medical theory and the emergence of more scientific approaches to understanding human sexuality. But it would take centuries for medical science to develop alternatives to the bizarre sexual theories that dominated medieval healthcare. The legacy of medieval sexual medicine would influence European and American attitudes towards sexuality, gender, and mental health well into the modern era. The idea that female sexuality was inherently pathological, that sexual pleasure was medically dangerous, and that emotional attachment could cause physical illness would persist in medical theory long after the specific theories of wandering wombs and passionate humours were abandoned. But as we near the end of our journey through medieval sexuality, we need to understand how all these contradictions, innovations, and persecutions would eventually resolve into the cultural attitudes that still influence our modern world. When we continue, we're going to explore how the sexual complexity of medieval Europe would ultimately shape Renaissance humanism, Protestant Reformation, and even contemporary debates about sexuality, gender, and personal freedom. The final chapter of our story will reveal how the medieval experiments in love, desire, and human connection that we've been exploring weren't just historical curiosities. They were the foundation for every struggle for sexual freedom and personal autonomy that continues to this day. Standing into her private study in 1450, Cassandra Fedele holds a letter that will change the course of European intellectual history forever. She's a 25-year-old Venetian scholar who has just been invited to lecture at the University of Padua, the first woman ever offered such a position. But Cassandra's revolutionary ideas aren't about mathematics or philosophy. She's about to present a radical new theory that will challenge everything medieval Europe believes about sexuality, relationships, and human nature itself. Her thesis, that the sexual contradictions and experiments we've witnessed throughout Medieval history weren't signs of moral decay or religious failure. They were humanity's natural progression toward a more enlightened understanding of love, desire, and personal freedom. Cassandra represents something entirely new in European culture, the emergence of Renaissance humanism that would take all the sexual complexity, innovation, and even the contradictions of medieval life and transform them into a philosophical foundation for individual liberty and human dignity. She's about to argue that the church-owned brothels, the courtly love traditions, the experimental households after the Black Death, and even the resistance to sexual persecution weren't accidents or aberrations. They were evidence of humanity's persistent drive towards sexual freedom and authentic self-expression. Her lecture, titled On the Natural Dignity of Human Desire, would be copied and distributed across Europe, influencing thinkers from Erasmus to Montaigne and laying intellectual groundwork that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and even modern concepts of human rights and sexual autonomy. Cassandra's argument begins with a stunning reinterpretation of medieval sexual history, where previous thinkers had seen chaos, contradiction, and moral decline. She sees evidence of human creativity and adaptability. The same society that created elaborate systems of sexual control also developed sophisticated methods for evading those controls. The same institutions that preached sexual purity also accommodated human needs for pleasure, companionship, and emotional connection. She points to the economic success of regulated prostitution districts as evidence that societies function better when they acknowledge rather than deny human sexuality. She cites the literary achievements of courtly love poets as proof that sexual passion can inspire intellectual and artistic excellence. She even argues that the experimental relationships formed after the Black Death demonstrated humanity's capacity for creating new forms of love and family that were more egalitarian and emotionally satisfying than traditional arrangements. But Cassandra's most radical insight concerns the role of women in medieval sexual culture. She argues that despite official oppression, medieval women had actually developed more sophisticated understanding of sexuality, reproduction, and emotional relationships than the male authorities who claimed to control them. The underground networks of contraceptive knowledge, the secret systems of female support, and the resistance to sexual persecution revealed women's intellectual capacity and moral agency in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and power. Cassandra's ideas were dangerous precisely because they used medieval precedent to argue for contemporary reform. If medieval societies could accommodate sexual diversity and relationship experimentation, and female autonomy, even within systems of official control, then Renaissance societies could certainly do better by openly embracing these values rather than maintaining hypocritical double standards. Her influence on Renaissance culture was profound and immediate. Artists began depicting sexuality with new openness and celebration. Writers started exploring themes of individual sexual autonomy and relationship choice. Political theorists began arguing that personal liberty, including sexual freedom, was a natural right that governments should protect rather than restrict. The impact on religious thought was equally significant. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther used arguments similar to Cassandra's to challenge Catholic authority, pointing out the contradiction between official sexual morality and actual clerical behaviour. The idea that individuals could have direct relationships with God without institutional mediation paralleled the concept that individuals could make autonomous decisions about their sexual and romantic lives without hierarchical control. I found evidence that Cassandra's ideas influenced the development of marriage laws throughout Renaissance Europe. Several Italian city-states modified their legal codes to allow more flexible divorce arrangements, to recognise some forms of same-sex partnership, and to protect women's property rights within marriage. These changes weren't just legal technicalities. They represented fundamental shifts toward recognising individual autonomy and relationship choice as legitimate social values. Cassandra's intellectual descendants would continue developing these ideas throughout the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft would build on Renaissance humanism to argue for complete sexual equality and individual liberty. The concept that personal relationships should be based on mutual affection rather than social obligation would eventually become the foundation for modern ideas about romantic love and companionate marriage. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Cassandra's influence was how it revealed the continuity between medieval sexual innovation and modern sexual freedom. The experimental households of plague survivors, the autonomous women who managed medieval contraception networks, the same-sex couples who formed recognised partnerships in medieval cities. These weren't primitive precursors to modern sexuality. They were sophisticated examples of human beings creating the kinds of relationships and sexual cultures that people still aspire to today. The Renaissance didn't invent sexual freedom or gender equality or relationship diversity. It simply provided intellectual frameworks for understanding and celebrating forms of human connection that had existed throughout the medieval history. Despite official opposition and social constraint, this realization has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between sexual freedom and social progress. The medieval evidence suggests that human beings have always been capable of creating egalitarian, diverse, and emotionally satisfying sexual cultures when given the opportunity. The obstacles have never been human nature or natural law. They've been political systems and social institutions that prioritise control over human flourishing. Cassandra's work also revealed how sexual freedom and intellectual freedom are fundamentally connected. The same social conditions that suppress sexual autonomy also suppress artistic creativity, scientific innovation, and political reform. Conversely, societies that embrace sexual diversity and relationship choice tend to be more innovative, prosperous, and intellectually dynamic. The Renaissance explosion of art, science, and philosophy wasn't coincidental with increased sexual openness. It was causally related. When people have the freedom to follow their hearts in their most intimate relationships, they also develop the confidence and creativity to challenge authority in other areas of life. This pattern would repeat throughout European history. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement, and even modern democratic revolutions all coincided with periods of increased sexual freedom and relationship experimentation. The connection isn't accidental. Personal autonomy and social progress are fundamentally linked. Cassandra's legacy also helps explain why sexual freedom remains controversial even in modern democratic societies. The arguments against sexual autonomy haven't really changed since medieval times. They're still based on claims that sexual freedom threatens social stability, religious authority, and traditional family structures. But the medieval evidence suggests that these fears are largely unfounded. Medieval societies that accommodated sexual diversity weren't less stable or prosperous than those that didn't. Medieval communities that embraced relationship experimentation weren't less moral or caring than those that enforced strict sexual control. If anything, the evidence points in the opposite direction. The most sexually repressive periods in medieval history, the witch trials, the adultery persecutions, the enforcement of clerical celibacy, were also periods of social instability, economic decline, and cultural stagnation. Conversely, the periods of relative sexual freedom, the early medieval acceptance of clerical marriage, the flourishing of courtly love culture, the experimental communities after the Black Death were characterized by economic growth, artistic achievement, and social innovation. Modern debates about sexual freedom, gender equality, and relationship diversity are essentially continuing arguments that began in medieval Europe. The same fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and individual autonomy that medieval people struggled with are still being debated today. Understanding medieval sexual history helps us recognize that these aren't new problems requiring new solutions. They're persistent human challenges that every generation must address based on their own values and circumstances. The medieval experiments in sexual freedom and relationship diversity provide evidence that human beings can create flourishing societies that embrace rather than suppress the full spectrum of human love and desire. But Cassandra's story also reminds us that progress isn't inevitable. The sexual freedoms that emerged during certain periods of medieval history were often reversed by political reaction and religious persecution. The experimental communities, the autonomous women, the diverse relationships that we've explored throughout our journey, many of these were ultimately destroyed by authorities who felt threatened by human freedom and creativity. The question for modern societies is whether we'll learn from this history or repeat its mistakes. Will we continue the medieval trajectory toward greater sexual freedom and relationship choice? Or will we allow fear and authoritarianism to reverse the progress that previous generations fought to achieve? As we prepare for the final chapter of our journey, we need to consider how the complex, contradictory, and ultimately hopeful story of medieval sexuality connects to our own struggles for freedom, equality, and authentic human connection. The medieval world wasn't a primitive precursor to modern enlightenment. It was a laboratory for human experimentation that produced insights about love, desire, and social organisation that remain relevant today. When we conclude our exploration, we're going to discover how the sexual innovations of medieval Europe continue to influence contemporary culture in ways that most people never recognise, and how understanding this hidden history can help us create better relationships, more egalitarian societies, and more fulfilling lives in our own time. As I sit here tonight, finishing this incredible journey through the hidden sexual history of medieval Europe, I can't help but think about Sarah, a 32-year-old software engineer from Portland, who sent me a message last week. She'd just ended a relationship where her partner tried to control every aspect of her life, her career, her friendships, even her appearance. "I felt like I was living in the Dark Ages," she wrote. But after learning about medieval women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who wielded sexual autonomy as political power, and Anna Hartmann, who risked death to help women control their own bodies, Sarah realised something profound. If women 1,000 years ago could fight for their freedom under those conditions, I can certainly do it today. Sarah's story isn't unique. Over the past year, I've received hundreds of messages from people who discovered that medieval history isn't just academic curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects our own struggles with love, desire, power, and freedom. And what that mirror reveals will fundamentally change how you understand not just history, but your own life and relationships. Think about everything we've uncovered together tonight. We discovered that medieval people weren't sexually repressed prudes living in ignorance and fear. They were complex human beings who created sophisticated systems for managing desire, love, and human connection under incredibly challenging circumstances. They developed underground networks for reproductive health that were more advanced than anything available to women until the 20th century. They established legal frameworks for same-sex relationships that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for hundreds of years. They created experimental communities after the Black Death that demonstrated how sexual freedom and social cooperation could flourish together. But perhaps, most importantly, they showed us that the fundamental human drives for autonomy, authentic connection, and sexual expression are so powerful that they persist even under the most oppressive conditions. Every time medieval authorities tried to control sexuality completely, human creativity found ways around those controls. Every time religious institutions preached absolute sexual purity, practical reality forced accommodations and compromises. Every time political systems tried to reduce sexuality to mere property exchange, people insisted on following their hearts instead of their obligations. This pattern continues today. The same forces that drove medieval women to create secret contraceptive networks are driving modern movements for reproductive rights. The same impulses that led medieval same-sex couples to form recognised partnerships, despite legal prohibition, are inspiring contemporary struggles for marriage equality. The same human needs for authentic emotional connection that created courtly love traditions are shaping modern ideas about romantic relationships and personal fulfillment. Understanding this continuity is liberating because it reveals that our contemporary struggles for sexual freedom aren't signs of moral decline or social chaos. They're the latest chapters in humanity's oldest story about the relationship between individual autonomy and social organisation. We're not fighting for something new and untested. We're fighting for something that human beings have always wanted and sometimes achieved, even under the most difficult circumstances. The medieval evidence also reveals something hopeful about human nature itself. Despite centuries of religious teaching that sexuality was sinful, political systems that treated women as property, and legal frameworks that denied individual autonomy, medieval people consistently chose love over law, connection over control, and authentic self-expression over social conformity. They proved that human beings are naturally inclined toward freedom, equality, and mutual care, not domination, hierarchy, and emotional repression. This has profound implications for how we approach contemporary relationships and social issues. If medieval people could create egalitarian partnerships, diverse families, and supportive communities while living under feudalism and religious authoritarianism, then modern people living in democratic societies with legal protections for individual rights should be able to do much better. The medieval experiments in sexual freedom also provide practical models that remain relevant today. The post-plague experimental households that combined emotional intimacy with economic cooperation and child-rearing responsibilities look remarkably similar to modern chosen families and intentional communities. The medieval understanding that sexual health requires both physical and emotional wellness anticipates contemporary approaches to relationship therapy and holistic healthcare. Even the medieval recognition that love and desire can't be completely controlled by social institutions remains important for people navigating contemporary relationship choices. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval sexual history is about the relationship between personal freedom and social progress. The periods of greatest artistic achievement, economic prosperity, and intellectual innovation in medieval Europe coincided with periods of relative sexual freedom and relationship experimentation. The most repressive and controlling periods were characterized by social stagnation, economic decline, and cultural decay. This pattern suggests that sexual freedom isn't a luxury that societies can afford only after they've solved other problems. It's a prerequisite for solving those problems. When people have the freedom to form authentic relationships based on mutual care and respect, they develop the emotional security and creative confidence needed to innovate in other areas of life. When people are forced to suppress their most fundamental desires and connections, they become less capable of contributing to social and economic progress. Understanding this connection helps explain why sexual freedom remains controversial even in modern democratic societies. The resistance isn't really about protecting traditional values or maintaining social stability. It's about protecting power structures that depend on limiting human autonomy and self-expression. Just as medieval authorities recognized that sexual freedom threatened their control over people's lives, modern authorities understand that people who have genuine autonomy in their intimate relationships are less likely to accept authoritarianism in other aspects of life. The medieval story also reveals the incredible courage and creativity of ordinary people who chose to prioritize love and human connection over social approval and institutional authority. The women who shared contraceptive knowledge despite the threat of being burned as witches. The same-sex couples who formed lasting partnerships despite legal persecution. The plague survivors who created new forms of family and community despite social chaos. These weren't exceptional people with superhuman strength. They were ordinary individuals who decided that authentic human connection was worth fighting for. Their example reminds us that social progress isn't created by institutions or authorities. It's created by regular people who make daily choices to prioritise human dignity and freedom over fear and control. Every time someone chooses to support a friend's unconventional relationship, every time someone challenges sexist or homophobic attitudes, every time someone insists on their right to make autonomous decisions about their own body and sexuality, they're continuing the work that medieval people began centuries ago. The journey we've taken together tonight also reveals how much we still don't know about human sexuality and relationships. Medieval people were conducting experiments in love, desire, and social organisation that modern researchers are only beginning to understand. They developed insights about the connections between sexuality, creativity, and social cooperation that could inform contemporary policy and personal choices. This suggests that instead of seeing sexuality as a problem to be solved or controlled, we might benefit from approaching it as an ongoing experiment in human possibility, just as medieval people created new forms of relationship and community in response to their historical circumstances. Modern people can create new approaches to love, family, and social organisation that reflect our own values and opportunities. As we reach the end of our journey, I want you to remember that the story we've explored together isn't just about the past, it's about the future. The sexual freedom and relationship diversity that medieval people fought for, experimented with, and sometimes achieved are still being fought for today. The human needs for autonomy, authentic connection, and self-expression that drove medieval innovations are the same needs that drive contemporary movements for equality and freedom. Understanding this continuity gives us both inspiration and responsibility. We're inspired by knowing that human beings have always been capable of creating more loving, egalitarian, and fulfilling relationships than their societies officially allowed. But we're also responsible for continuing this work in our own time, using the freedoms that previous generations fought to achieve and extending those freedoms to people who still don't have access to them. The medieval world shows us that sexual freedom isn't just about individual happiness, it's about creating societies that support human flourishing in all its diverse forms. When we fight for reproductive rights, marriage equality, gender recognition, and relationship choice, we're not just pursuing personal goals, we're participating in humanity's longest-running experiment in creating social systems that honour the full spectrum of human love and desire. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I hope you'll remember the courage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who used her sexual autonomy to reshape European politics. Think about the creativity of the medieval women who developed underground networks for reproductive health. Remember the resilience of the plague survivors who created new forms of family and community from the ashes of traditional society. Their stories remind us that human beings are capable of creating beautiful, loving, and egalitarian relationships, even under the most challenging circumstances. And most importantly, remember that their story is your story too. The same drives for freedom, authenticity, and genuine connection that motivated medieval people continue to motivate people today. The future of human sexuality and relationships depends on whether we have the courage to continue their experiments and build on their achievements. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden world of medieval sexuality. It's been an honour to share these stories with you and to explore together how understanding our past can help us create a better future. I hope tonight's exploration has given you new perspectives on love, relationships, and human possibility. Please let me know in the comments what surprised you most about medieval sexual history, and which of these stories resonated most strongly with your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to continue exploring the hidden stories that connect our past to our present. Sweet dreams, everyone. Tomorrow, we'll begin a new adventure together, uncovering more secrets from history that illuminate the mysteries of human experience. Until then, May your sleep be filled with dreams of the courage, creativity, and love that have always defined the best of human nature.